Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any point pursuant to Committee Rule 4. The Chair announces that the Chair may postpone further proceedings on any vote relating to any matter under consideration during today's markup. Pursuant to notice, we meet today to mark up 14 measures. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements or extraneous materials on today's business. As members were notified yesterday, we intend to first consider 12 bipartisan measures en bloc. Then we will move on to consider the ANS to H.R. 1004 and finish with consideration of H.R. 9. So let's proceed to the en bloc. The measures are H.R. 2002, the Taiwan Assurance Act of 2019, H.R.S. 273, reaffirming the United States' commitment to Taiwan and to the implementation of the Taiwan Relations Act, H.R. 97, Rescuing Animals with Rewards Act, RAWR, H.R. 753, Global Electoral Exchange Act of 2019, H.R. 1704, Championing American Business Through Diplomacy Act of 2019, H.R. 1952, Inter-Country Adoption Information Act with a Smith Amendment, H.R. 615, the Refugee Sanitation Facility Safety Act of 2019, H.R. 526, the Cambodia Democracy Act, H.R.S. 106, Denouncing Female Genital Mutilation, H.R. 1359, Digital Global Access Policy Act of 2019, H.R. 951, U.S.-Mexico Tourism Improvement Act, and H.R. 2116, the Global Fragility Act. I'll now recognize myself to speak on the en bloc measures. I strongly support all of these bipartisan bills and resolutions in this package. Because we have limited time and a lot of business to get to today, I'll keep my remarks brief. First, I was very pleased to work with Ranking Member McCall on H.R.S. 273 and H.R. 2002, two bipartisan measures to further strengthen the U.S.-Taiwan partnership. Tomorrow marks the 40th anniversary of the Taiwan Relations Act, and it's important for Congress to reaffirm our commitment to Taiwan and the implementation of that landmark legislation. Next, we have the Global Fragility Act, another bill that I introduced along with Mr. McCall. This legislation passed our committee and the House last Congress, and I'm pleased that we're considering it again today. It will help strengthen and coordinate our government's efforts to help countries become stronger and more stable, and thus make it harder for terrorists, criminals, and other violent groups to put down roots. I'm also happy to join with Mr. McCall on H.R. 1704, the Championing American Business Through Diplomacy Act, which prioritizes commercial diplomacy so the State Department can better support American businesses in the global market. When we think of the importance of diplomacy for American businesses, we must look at our southern border. Mexico is one of our largest trading partners, and the proximity between our two nations makes the U.S.-Mexico tourism industry an important economic driver. The U.S. tourism industry would suffer if President Trump follows through on his ill-advised desire to close the U.S.-Mexico border. The U.S.-Mexico Tourism Improvement Act, a common-sense bill introduced by Mr. Cuellar and Mr. McCall, would benefit both our countries. This legislation will increase exchange programs in a number of economic sectors and demonstrate the kind of mutually beneficial partnership Congress wants with Mexico. I'm also happy to support Mr. Yoho's Cambodia Democracy Act. This bill codifies existing sanctions to hold Cambodia's leaders accountable for their crackdowns on democracy and stripping the Cambodian people of their rights. We have two other strong measures on human rights before us today as well. H.R.S. 106, introduced by Ms. Frankel and Mr. Perry, rightly denounces female genital mutilation as an egregious violation of women's and girls' human rights. And Ms. Meng and Mr. Zeldin's Refugee Sanitation Facility Act will help provide women, girls, and other vulnerable populations with safe and secure access to sanitation facilities and refugee camps. We also have a number of other good bipartisan measures that our committee passed last Congress. First, the Inter-Country Adoption Information Act creates more transparency in the international adoption process, so prospective parents are better informed about policy changes that could affect their adoptions. Next, the Rescuing Animals with Rewards Act, which embraces and enhances U.S. efforts to combat wildlife trafficking by authorizing rewards for information leading to the arrest or conviction of those engaged in the illicit wildlife trade. The Digital Global Access Policy Act, which passed the House last year, makes it a U.S. foreign policy priority to promote Internet access in the developing world. And finally, we have the Global Electoral Exchange Act, which also passed the House last Congress. This bill, introduced by Mr. Castro and Mr. Meadows, would establish a program at the State Department to exchange best practices for elections around the world. I'm pleased to support all of these bills, and I'd like to thank our members for their hard work. And now I'll recognize my friend, our ranking member, Mr. McCall of Texas, for any remarks he might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today our committee will mark up and pass key legislation that will expand our economic prosperity and strengthen our national security. One of today's bills is my Championing American Business Diplomacy Act, which I'm pleased that my friend Chairman Engel co-sponsored. Legislation makes the promotion of U.S. economic interest a principal duty of our missions abroad. It also requires economic and commercial training for our diplomats serving overseas. By creating more international opportunities for American businesses, we can push back on growing Russian and Chinese influence across the globe. We will also be marking up legislation that recognizes and strengthens our relationship with Taiwan. Taiwan is a strong democratic ally and is increasingly under threat from Communist China. My Taiwan Assurance Act, which Chairman Engel also co-sponsored, reaffirms our support for Taiwan's defense capabilities and advocates for their participation in international organizations. As we celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Taiwan Relations Act, it is important for our Taiwanese friends to know that our alliance will only grow stronger. Although our national security strategy has prioritized threats from rising nation states, we cannot forget about threats that stem from weak and fragile states. These states are underdeveloped and often suffer from violent conflicts that are exploited by terror groups. Our Global Fragility Act, which establishes the Global Fragility Initiative, will serve as an interagency policy framework to better coordinate and prioritize our efforts to stabilize conflict areas. This will help prevent violence and extremism from spreading around the world. This is an important bipartisan bill that could have very positive results over time. We will also consider legislation to combat wildlife trafficking, denounce the barbaric practice of female genital mutilation, improve tourism between the United States and Mexico, strengthen inter-country adoption, and support democratic movements around the world. I believe these bills should win strong bipartisan support from our committee, and I look forward to seeing them pass on the floor of the House. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McCall. Does anyone seek recognition for the purpose of speaking on the en bloc package? Ms. Omar.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman. I really appreciate the effort to put forth a lot of bills that I will be voting yes on. But I wanted to take this opportunity to speak two bills that I am co-sponsoring. The first is H.R. 615, the Refugee Sanitation Facility Safety Act. I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor of this bill, which will provide much-needed protection for girls and women in refugee camps around the world. Obviously, this issue is very personal to me. Girls and women in refugee camps are often unable to use sanitation facilities for fear of sexual assault. Ensuring that our support for refugee camps worldwide emphasizes the need to protect vulnerable populations is critically important. I want to express my support for my colleague, Congresswoman Ming, for introducing this important legislation, and to my many colleagues on this committee who have co-sponsored this bill. I specifically want to thank my colleague, Mr. Zeldin, who is currently the only Republican co-sponsor of this bill. Secondly, I want to express my strong support for H.R. 2116, the Global Fragility Act. Conflict prevention and support for fragile states should be the forefront of our foreign policy. I am thankful to Chairman Engel, Ranking Member McCall, and other members of this committee for introducing this bill, and I am excited to be supporting and voting yes for it. Thank you so much for the bills that you have put forth, and I look forward to this great work continuing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Chairman, I wish to convey my strong support for Congressman Collins' Intercountry Adoption Information Act and briefly explain the amendment that I am offering today. Just parenthetically, I've long been a strong supporter of adoption. Matter of fact, back in 1989, I introduced legislation with over 100 co-sponsors to create the adoption tax credit of $5,000. That was included in the contract with America. And it has doubled since, and now people who are faced with upfront adoption expenses can get up to a $13,000 worth of tax credit. It is still not enough, especially for intercountry adoptions. As we all know, all too often parents who are willing to open their hearts and homes to meet are met with resistance from foreign governments who hold children hostage. In the past, we saw this happen in countries such as Ethiopia and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and I've had hearings on the DRC and that policy that they had, though with the change of leadership, both countries, we believe, are changing. Beyond external obstacles placed on foreign governments which we cannot control, there are ones which we can control within our own government. Chief among them are the onerous fees that adopted parents must pay. A Senate Appropriations Committee report last year called upon the State Department to assess whether such fees place, and I quote, undue financial burden on families seeking to adopt internationally, especially low-income families, families seeking to adopt sibling groups, or families seeking to adopt children with disabilities. Despite this directive, the State Department did not provide this information, hence the need for this amendment. I hope members will support it. It will require a report within 180 days of the law's enactment, so we do not have to wait over a year to obtain this information. I yield back and thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other members seeking recognition on the en bloc? Ms. Houlihan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to take a moment to speak on the bipartisan resolution denouncing the practice of female genital mutilation. I'm very pleased that my colleague from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry, is co-leading this resolution, and it is my honor to be a co-sponsor. Genital cutting harms 3 million girls annually, jeopardizing their health, their safety, and violating their right to their autonomy over their own bodies. I hope this resolution will be a starting point for a larger and bipartisan conversation about women's health, including their access to contraception, preventing maternal deaths, and ending child marriage. With that in mind, I would be remiss if I spoke to the importance of this resolution without mentioning the great work of the United Nations Population Fund. The UNFPA is a leader in helping communities abandon the practice of female genital mutilation, and it plays a key role in addressing women's health needs around the world. In spite of that, the President's administration has requested in its budget that Congress defund this critical program. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution and to continue to support funding for programs like the UNFPA. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Wright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you and Ranking Member McCall for agreeing to include H.R. 1359, the Digital Gap Act, in today's markup, which I introduced with Ranking Member McCall and Representative Bella and Lou. Today, the Internet remains out of reach for more than half the world's population. That means 4 billion people, predominantly those in developing countries and women, do not have access to the benefits the Internet provides, like the free flow of information, life-changing innovations in health and education, and e-commerce. Expanding Internet access is critical to driving economic growth, reducing poverty, improving education and health care, empowering women, bolstering democratic principles, and advancing U.S. interests around the globe. The Digital Gap Act will bring us one step closer to universal Internet access by promoting common sense build once policies, by working to remove tax and regulatory barriers to investment, and by increasing public-private partnerships in Internet infrastructure projects. The United States has long been a leader in promoting expanded Internet access, and passing the Digital Gap Act today will ensure we continue this leadership. Thank you again, Chairman and Ranking Member, for including this bill, and I urge my colleagues to support all the bills in bloc. Thank you. Now yield back.
Thank you. Is there any other member seeking recognition on the en bloc? Having heard no further requests for recognition, then, without objection, the committee will proceed to consider the noticed items en bloc. Without objection, the Smith Amendment to H.R. 1952 is agreed to. The question occurs on the measures en bloc as amended. All those in favor say aye. 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 All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The measures considered en bloc are agreed to, and without objection, each measure in the en bloc is ordered favorably reported as amended. Without objection, staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes, and the chair is authorized to seek House consideration under suspension of the rules. Now on to the next item of business. We're temporarily waiting for bills on the floor, and when that happens, we'll suspend, but I think it's probably better to just continue. Have votes been called yet? Not yet. Okay. Okay. All right. Pursuant to notice for purposes of markup, I now call up H.R. 1004, prohibiting unauthorized action in Venezuela Act. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 1004, to prohibit the introduction of United States Armed Forces into hostilities with respect to Venezuela and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. Without objection, the bill shall be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I now offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will please report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1004, offered by Mr. Engel and Mr. Cicilline. Strike all after the enacting clause and insert the following. Section 1, short title. This act may be cited.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered base text for purposes of further amendment. And I now recognize myself for remarks on H.R. 1004. First of all, I want to thank Mr. Cicilline for authoring this bipartisan bill and for his testimony before this committee last month. Having just returned from the Colombia-Venezuela border, it saddens me to see just how quickly conditions in Venezuela are deteriorating. I heard truly heartbreaking stories from so many migrants and refugees who have fled the country. And I am pleased that in the past month our committee advanced 3 key pieces of legislation, all of which passed the House, that keep the pressure on Nicolas Maduro and support the Venezuelan people. Frankly, I'd prefer to focus our committee's attention solely on supporting the people of Venezuela in the struggle for a better future. But unfortunately, we are forced to respond and reinforce the role of Congress under the Constitution and the War Powers Resolution. I do believe that it's Congress's right and ability to declare war, and I think for too long we have been abrogating our responsibility to the executive branch, no matter who the president was. There are some who will say we shouldn't have a debate in Congress over the use of force in Venezuela. Instead, we should wait and see what the president decides to do before we even have a conversation about the use of force. I must respectfully disagree. Under Article 1 of our Constitution, it is the responsibility of Congress to decide whether America will go to war. If the president wants to threaten military force, the War Powers Resolution specifies that he needs to make sure Congress supports that decision and will be prepared to authorize it if necessary. So the bill we are considering today should really be unnecessary. Presidents should just follow the Constitution and the law. But unfortunately, we've all seen presidents of both parties carry out military interventions without coming to Congress. So today's legislation simply reasserts the legal requirement that the president must work with us now, not after U.S. troops are put in harm's way. We've ceded our authority for far too long, sitting on the sidelines. If we don't take action, the executive branch will keep disregarding the law and ignoring our role in this process. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Maduro is a kleptocratic dictator, and the Venezuelan people deserve better. We must continue to assert pressure on the regime and provide support for the Venezuelan people. None of this effort is undermined by reminding the Trump administration that they must uphold the Constitution and come to Congress for any military authorization. To avoid this conversation would be irresponsible and a shirking of our most solemn responsibility. So I support this measure, and I urge all members to join me in doing so. And I'll now recognize our ranking member, Mr. McCall of Texas, for the purpose of his remarks on H.R. 1004.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I strongly oppose H.R. 1004, and I'm gravely concerned that this exercise today is both dangerous and political. I understand the majority wants to send a message to President Trump. And sadly, most Democrats won't directly recognize Juan Guaido as a legitimate interim president. But it's the Venezuelan people who are fighting for their freedom that this measure will hurt. Simply put, the ultimate winner of this markup in our division here today is Maduro and his failed socialist regime. Colombian President Duque said this to me, and I strongly believe when he said that the credible threat of force is keeping interim President Guaido alive and deterring Maduro from further escalation of violence against innocent Venezuelan people we are trying to support. We must not underestimate this regime's cruelty, and Chairman and I saw it firsthand. They are starving their people, refusing to let humanitarian aid into the country. Maduro is holding approximately 864 political prisoners as we mark up this bill, including 6 Citgo workers, 4 of which are from my home state of Texas. He has unleashed armed colectivos who murder Venezuelans with impunity. I had the honor of meeting Juan Guaido's wife, and she expressed her concern over the serious danger facing her husband. I also met the family of Guaido's chief of staff, Roberto Marrero, who remains imprisoned after being swept up by Maduro's Cuban-backed intelligence services. Shortly after we met, the Maduro regime revoked Guaido's parliamentary immunity and is threatening to arrest him based on allegations of terrorism. Our administration has stated its commitment to a peaceful resolution, and we are all supportive of this, but the conditions on the ground are getting worse, not better. I just visited the Venezuela-Colombian border with Chairman Engel and witnessed the devastation and the humanitarian crisis. 50,000 Venezuelans escape every day, and Maduro is solely to blame. The U.S. sanctions are working, but they need more time to have effect. The administration has made clear that more can and will be done to financially constrain the regime. Last week, I was with Vice President Pence at a speech in Houston where he announced a new round of sanctions targeting Venezuelan oil shipments to Cuba. We have a coalition of 54 countries supporting the opposition. Maduro is feeling the heat. We should not give him reason to breathe a sigh of relief. We all want to see a peaceful transition in Venezuela through free and fair elections. And to make this happen, Maduro must understand that the best outcome is to step down and leave the country peacefully. However, this legislation jeopardizes that outcome by appearing to take military force off the table and handing a propaganda win to Maduro. It also emboldens the Cubans and the Russians, who are the real interventionists in Venezuela. And speaking of Cuba and Russia, I would not be surprised if this bill helps create propaganda showing division in Washington over our policy in Venezuela during this markup. Let me be clear, I'm a strong supporter of the sole power of Congress to declare war under Article 1. If the circumstance presented itself, I would be the first to push Congress to act. Opponents of this bill are not advocating for military action. We simply don't want to handcuff ourselves and limit our options to end this crisis. So I hope that my colleagues can recognize the dangers of passing this bill at this time and join me in voting against it. Any actions this Congress takes regarding Venezuela, in my judgment, should be bipartisan and demonstrate unity of our common values of freedom and democracy, which we all stand for. The Venezuelan people have suffered enough. Let's not let this bill complicate their efforts to achieve freedom from socialist tyranny and put an end to this humanitarian disaster. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McCall. Votes on the floor have been called, so I'm going to do a recess now. Once members have voted, I ask that please all members return as soon as possible to continue the markup, and then we will have others who wish to speak on the bill, and some members have amendments to offer as well. So the committee stands in recess, subject to the call of the chair, and we'll start right after votes are done with on the floor. Okay, the committee will come to order. I realize that members wish to speak on the bill. Some members may wish to speak on the bill, and that some members may have amendments to offer. If members have general remarks on the bill, we could hear those now and then move on to amendments. So is there anyone who would like to make a general remark on any of the bills?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for holding this markup today and for considering H.R. 1004, a bipartisan bill with 64 co-sponsors. As the Chairman noted, we are offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute to be considered as base text, and I ask all of my colleagues on the committee to support this legislation. I wish this bill was not necessary. I would prefer we spend our time working to find ways to support the Venezuelan people and their efforts to establish democracy in Venezuela. However, because of the belligerent and irresponsible language by Trump administration officials, we have no choice as a Congress but to weigh in and ensure that this administration understands that it does not have consent to engage in war in Venezuela. This bill very simply restates the law as already enforced in the War Powers Act and laid out in our Constitution that any military force with respect to Venezuela must be authorized by Congress. So if you have a disagreement with this bill, you have a disagreement with the Constitution. Nicolas Maduro is a dictator whose regime has destroyed Venezuela's economy, starved its people, and engaged in widespread corruption and repression. The people of Venezuela deserve a better future, a future they determine. And we all believe the Venezuelan people have a right to pick their leaders, a right Maduro has denied his people by refusing to hold free and fair elections. Nicolas Maduro is the responsible party when it comes to the current situation in Venezuela. We must have a policy that continues to place pressure on him and that seeks a diplomatic solution in Venezuela. But the Trump administration's use of rhetoric surrounding military force in Venezuela is unfortunate and counterproductive. Not only would military intervention be illegal, it would also come with serious consequences that I fear would not only hurt the Venezuelan people, but also the prospects for democracy. Under the Constitution and the War Powers Act, the President may not take unilateral military action and must consult with and receive authorization from Congress. As Special Representative Elliott Abrams confirmed when he was here testifying before this committee, the conditions for unilateral presidential military action have not been met. Congress has not declared war on Venezuela. There is not any existing statutory authorization that would allow for a military intervention in Venezuela, and Venezuela has not attacked the United States, its territories or possessions, or its armed forces. Yet the administration continues the drumbeat of aggressive, saber-rattling rhetoric, promoting military intervention as an option, the only country of the coalition that continues to make that claim. This administration has already shown their willingness to take illegal military action without consulting Congress, such as when they launched attacks on the Assad regime without proper authorization. I understand that some of my colleagues will say that while they don't support military intervention in Venezuela, they oppose this bill because they don't think it's necessary, or they think it's unnecessarily partisan, or that its passing could harm Juan Guaido. I'd like to respond to this line of argument. First, the bill is absolutely necessary in order for Congress to be clear about what our expectations are surrounding military action in Venezuela. I'd like to refer to the testimony of Deborah Pearlstein, a professor of law at the Cardozo School of Law and a witness at the hearing we held last month on this bill. She said, and I quote, "The president's power waxes and wanes as a function of what Congress does. When Congress has said nothing, the president is acting in effectively a constitutional twilight zone." She continued, "The president is in a different constitutional position when Congress has affirmatively said not yet or no. And that is the shift that this legislation would make," end quote. If you want to properly exercise our constitutional authority in light of the administration's ongoing rhetoric, we are compelled to act. Second, to the criticism that this bill makes the issue of Venezuela partisan, I would say please join us in supporting this common sense legislation, and let's send a clear and bipartisan message to the administration and to the world that Congress has decided to stop abrogating our constitutional role in military affairs. The only reason we're here considering this bill today is because the administration took it upon itself to threaten a war it doesn't have an authorization to start. And third, to the argument that passing this legislation could put Mr. Guaido in danger, I have to respond by saying that I have the utmost respect and admiration for Mr. Guaido, but must point out that his security is threatened by the very nature of who he is and how he has chosen to stand up for the people of Venezuela. I admire his courage greatly, but we cannot allow the potential brutish actions of Nicolas Maduro to dictate American foreign policy decisions. Finally, to the argument that this bill would take pressure off Maduro or take any options off the table, This is simply not reflected in the substance of the bill. This bill takes no options off the table. If the administration wanted to come to Congress tomorrow to discuss authorization for military action, it could do so. The U.S. Constitution and the War Powers Resolution have set up the checks and balances framework for American military action, not this legislation. I'd like to finish by saying that this administration has shown a troubling disregard for the Constitution and for Congress. That is why I introduced this legislation, and that's why we must pass it. U.S. military action with respect to Venezuela would be illegal and ill-advised. Americans do not want another endless foreign military engagement, and the administration has not made any case based on American national security or our interest for intervention in Venezuela. Rather than threaten war, the United States must continue to work with the Lima Group, Europe, and the international community to use diplomatic and economic tools to pressure Maduro to honor the will of his people. Congress should do everything in its power to support a peaceful, truly democratic transition of power in Venezuela. I'm thankful to the more than 60 bipartisan co-sponsors, many of the members of this committee who are supporting this bill, and I ask my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join me in voting in support of the Constitution, in support of Congress's role, and in support of this bill. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Yoho, did you wish to speak?
Yes, sir, I did.
Okay.
After Mr. Kinzinger.
Okay, Mr. Kinzinger is recognized.
Well, I thank the gentleman, and thank you, Chairman. I'm going to try to do this as professionally without getting upset as I can. I want to talk briefly about what's going on in Venezuela, a disgusting situation. People are starving to death. We're seeing firsthand the failure of autocratic rule, of socialism. In the process, Mr. Maduro has decided that he is going to maintain power against the legitimately elected president, Mr. Guaido of Venezuela. If the United States wants to pressure Maduro out of his fake office that he does not have the right to have, we have what's called the dime model, diplomatic, information, military, and economic things at our disposal. My friend, Mr. Cicilline, just said that, we need to use diplomatic and economic processes to force a solution here. And the thing I'd make mention of that is when you're dealing with an enemy or an adversary, the only thing that makes diplomacy effective, as well as economic, is a military option on the table, is having that threat there. If you look at North Korea, what is it that compelled Kim Jong-un to the table? It was the threat of military force. What is it that took him away from table? It was the removal of the military threat. That's the same situation in Venezuela. But let's say if this passes, what does this do? Let's say Mr. Guaido, President Guaido, is held captive. Let's say he is captured by Maduro. We cannot use military force to rescue him. Let's say we want to put food aid in to save the people that are starving to death in Venezuela, and we need the military to escort food to people. They would be prohibited from doing it after this. Let's say the Russians build a military base in Venezuela and start flying fighter caps over the country and basically declare it Russian territory. This would prevent the United States from doing anything in response.
The gentleman yield for...
No, I will not. Let me finish. I listen politely to you, sir. Let's say that they build a military base. The United States cannot introduce any military action to push back against it. Let's say a massacre occurs in Venezuela. The United States cannot use the military to stop it. If you look at what happened in Rwanda, one of the greatest regrets of the Clinton administration is inaction because of a massacre. If this situation happens in Venezuela, which is not that far out to think of, we would be prevented. Now, sure, we could come here and have a debate. And if you think that this House can have a grown-up debate about this by taking away the power that the president legitimately has under Article 2 in the Constitution, if we're already political about Venezuela, imagine what it'll become at that point. Imagine the politics while a massacre is occurring. By the way, I actually thought about introducing an amendment to this to add Canada to the list, and Jamaica, and every other country, because if we're going to now pass resolutions saying we can't introduce military force in Venezuela, we may as well say the same thing about Canada or any other country that we have no intention at this point of going to war against. It would just make sense. That's about the purpose of this bill. And the other thing I want to say, Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, I have been on this committee now, I guess this is my 5th year. I've been in Congress for 9 years. And one of the things I have just loved about this committee is our ability to really come together in bipartisan ways. In fact, the entire time I think that I was on Foreign Affairs up until this year, we've never taken a recorded vote in this committee. because everything we've done, we've had debates, we've had discussions, but we've really worked together to advance the interest of the United States of America. Even when President Obama was president, we would have hearings that could get a little contentious on things like Syria and that kind of stuff. But for the most part, we would pass resolutions that we all agreed on. But so far on this committee, we've done something about Yemen, and now we're doing something about Venezuela. Mr. Chairman, my request to you, as passionately as I can ask it, is can we at least pick a week in the next month, or when we come back from break, where we can actually do things on a bipartisan basis again and kind of see how it feels. Because if it feels good, maybe we can get back to that as the way we do things on committee. Instead of bringing up bills and passing them to make a point about the Trump administration. By the way, I can't think of crazy rhetoric. I mean, look, there's rhetoric the president does that I don't always agree with, but I can't think of that on Venezuela. He gave a really passionate speech in Florida about freedom, in Venezuela and Cuba. He said the military action is not off the table, as he should say, with any situation like that, because it gives teeth to diplomacy. So this is an answer in search of a problem. There is no problem, and I don't know why we're taking this up. I had actually thought we were going to have a hearing and let this go away, but again, we're back here. So, look, I'm fired up. I'm passionate about it. I respect everybody on this committee, but this is just really bothersome to me, and I yield back.
Well, I'm sorry that the gentleman thinks that people should not be allowed to express their opinions on the Foreign Affairs Committee. I've been on this committee a long time, and I believe that we ought to have more people speaking their mind, not less. Anyone on this side? Mr. Sherman.
I'd just like to briefly respond to the last speaker. There is no more bipartisan committee in Congress than this one, and in fact, this very markup, we have quite a number of pieces of bipartisan legislation that will pass. It is true that watching Congress does not inspire one that this is the finest decision-making body assembled in history. But to say for that reason we should leave all decision-making about matters of life and death to this administration, I think that goes a little too far. Especially it goes too far under our Constitution, which vests in Congress the right to send this country to war. This is a very reasonable proposal. It says we should not invade Venezuela. If there are developments that come up, the President can call us into special session and we can deal with them immediately. But to say that to support this bill is to ignore the genocide in Rwanda and the lessons that it taught us is absurd. It is far more likely that this administration will invade Venezuela and do harm than it is that we're going to see a Rwanda-style genocide in Venezuela that somehow the Trump administration would prevent were it not for this bill. With that, I yield to the gentleman from Rhode Island.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I attempted to ask the gentleman who was just speaking, my Republican colleague, a question. And the question is, the scenarios that you described for the committee that were horrific, and you said this bill would stop us from doing anything about it. That is absolutely not true. Nothing in this bill would limit the ability of Congress to authorize intervention in any way we see appropriate. It simply reaffirms that Congress has a role and that we be held accountable for those decisions. It's easy to say, you know what, Mr. President, you make this decision. We'll avoid our responsibility, because then we avoid the tough decisions. That's what we were elected to do. That's what the Constitution requires, that we deliberate, that we, before we send men and women into harm's way, to risk their lives in defense of our country, that we own that responsibility, that we debate it and we vote on it, because we reflect the will of the American people. So it's nothing in the legislation changes the Constitution. It doesn't limit the president's power. It doesn't change the Constitution. It simply is a reminder, in light of the rhetoric of this president, that Congress must authorize military action. That's all it is. This is about reaffirming our responsibility. The reason we don't have Canada in the bill is I haven't heard the president threaten military action in Canada. But we've heard him say repeatedly, military option is on the table. Then I just heard people say, oh, it really isn't. We don't want to do it. Then you should vote for the bill. This is about preserving Congress's role as a deliberative body in decisions of war and peace. That's what we were elected to do. That's what we get paid to do. I know it's easier if we avoid the tough decisions and just leave it up to the president. Our Constitution requires something more. And so all I'm asking is to support this bill, which just reaffirms. And by the way, the group, the international group, the Lima group, they all managed to be playing a very productive role in a peaceful transition to a democracy without the threat of military force. The United States is an outlier. We don't need to be in that position. This is a moment for Congress to do its job, to assert its authority as set forth by our founding fathers in our Constitution, and to be responsible before we send men and women into harm's way.
I'll reclaim my time. Yeah. I think the gentleman makes an excellent point, and I think that if action in the future should be taken in Venezuela, this Congress can make a well-reasoned decision. I then yield back and then recognize the gentleman, Mr. Yoho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this is a very important topic, obviously, to go on this long. I just want to remind my colleagues, not just on the other side, but all of us here, we're making a decision here in a bill form versus a resolution saying that the president can't do this. And I don't remember the president saying he was going to go in there. He just said all options are on the table. And I think with the tinderbox that Venezuela is right now, I think what you're seeing play out there is it's not about Venezuela. This is a lot more than Venezuela. This is the Cuban government that has been propping up Venezuela for years with 10 to 40,000 troops protecting Maduro, before that, Chavez, and then you've got the Russians in there. And if Venezuela falls, so does Cuba. And so to take military option off the table, and the president, like I said, he never said he was going in there, and I truly believe that if he was, he would come to Congress and ask for that authority. But to play into the hands of the Maduro regime, the Cuban regime, the Russians, who are probably watching this, saying, look at the Americans. They're divided on this issue in their own party, and we haven't done anything. We are worried about it. This is not a genocide. My colleague, Mr. Sherman, said there's no genocide there like Rwanda. Let's hope there's not. There wasn't a genocide in Syria, but now there's over 500,000 people that have been slaughtered because Russia got in there and backed up Assad. Do we want that same thing in our hemisphere? And I asked my colleague from Rhode Island, who's a small business owner, are you doing this for the benefit of the Venezuelan people, or is it for a disdain for this president?
I'm happy to answer if you'll yield.
I'm not going to yield that.
Well, you asked a question. Now you're going to yield to let me answer it?
I'm not going to. I've got to yield some time to my colleague here, Mr. Kinzinger.
Well, I thank the gentleman, and just a couple of points. The key in Venezuela right now is getting the military to abandon the fake regime, the Maduro fake regime. When you take military off the table, the military is not very compelled to abandon the regime because they don't see a threat. They see the Russians introduced there. They see, tens of thousands of Cuban people holding up the regime. The mere threat of force can cause the military to abandon Mr. Maduro. Secondly, to my friend, you mentioned that this really does nothing outside of the War Powers Act. The War Powers Act gives the president flexibility to move, and then he has to advise Congress, and then eventually it comes to Congress for a vote. This expressly prohibits the president from introducing any military force unless it's to rescue a U.S. citizen. So it expressly prohibits the U.S. from using military force to create a humanitarian corridor, to rescue Guaido, to stop a genocide. I'm not saying a genocide is going to happen, but who knows what can happen in this environment, any flash kind of issue like this. This bill expressly prohibits that. So it would be actually pretty hard to say that the president can act within the War Powers Resolution when this bill, if passed and signed into law, of course it won't be, when this bill says the president can't do anything unless it's in defense of an American who's being held hostage. And I also want to make one other quick point. I supported President Obama in his actions in Syria in 2013. I wanted the president to attack the regime. The president came to Congress. The president, I don't think, needed to come to Congress in 2013. He could have made the decision on his own, like President Trump did, in fighting back and pushing and enforcing the red line against chemical weapons. When it came to Congress, and I'll blame my side as much as anything for this, it became political when he brought it to Congress and we did not give him the authority to attack. And we look in the Middle East, and most people would agree the biggest mistake ever made in Syria was the failure to enforce the red line in 2013. And there have been a number of mistakes since then. I'm not playing the old what ifs and the Wayback Game. But I am making the point that I believe a president should have the ability to do foreign policy on a speed-type situation like this without every little tiny action having to come to Congress, because I'm not commander-in-chief and nobody in here is commander-in-chief. With that, I'll yield back to the gentleman from Florida.
I appreciate your
You ready?
comments. No, not right yet, but I appreciate you trying. We need to keep in mind that the legitimate president is President Guaido, and we are weakening his hand to take over as a legitimate president of that country when they see the Americans saying, well, you know what, we're backing away from this, we're going to let whatever happens. And I think we've seen that happen in Libya and other countries, and I think this is a time that we stay united as we go to vote on this today, that we stay united as the U.S. Congress and send a strong message that all options are on the table, and I suggest that we vote no on this. I yield back.
The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Malinowski, is recognized.
Thank you. Look, I appreciate the comments from Mr. Kinzinger and others on the other side. Let me see if I can find some common ground here. I think there are two separate questions. One is, should the use of force be on the table? The other is, what is the process for making these decisions? I appreciate the comments of Ranking Member McCall that those who oppose this resolution are not necessarily in favor of the use of military force. I would argue the opposite is also true for many of us. Those who are willing to vote in favor of this resolution are not necessarily opposed to the use of force under any and all circumstances. I can imagine circumstances under which I would vote very rapidly in favor of the use of force in Venezuela. Mr. Kinzinger mentioned some of those hypothetical situations. So I don't think it's the case that this would automatically become politicized if President Trump were to come here. I recognize Mr. Guaido as the legitimate leader of Venezuela. I think we should recognize that as a Congress, and I would support legislation to that effect as well. But I think what this legislation is about is process. It's about whether in that circumstance the United States Congress should play a role in making a decision, and for that narrow reason I would vote in favor of it. I yield.
I am. No? Who? I'm sorry, Mr. Perry is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, I think the process is clear. The Constitution is clear. The President is already limited and should not be limited further in this case or any other case. And it seems to me that if we want to stand with the freedom-loving people of America and Venezuela, we have a choice here of either allowing the process to take its course if need be, because if any committee should understand this, we should understand that diplomacy without a strong deterrence, without a strong military response capability is like a saw without teeth. And the conversation we're having right now in this committee about this discussion, whoever's watching, I'm sure the Communist Chinese are loving this. I'm sure the Cuban government is loving this. And I'm sure the Russians are happy to collude on this. We either stand with the freedom-loving people of Venezuela or we don't. We either send a message to Maduro that America does not stand with him or we don't. And that's what this is going to end up being. That's what this vote is going to be about. It's shirts and skins at this point. If you don't get that, I think you're missing the bigger picture. The process is already clear. There already is a law. There already is a Constitution limiting the President to act as he should, and then following up as we should is the process that's been outlined. And usurping that only emboldens our enemies and Venezuela's enemies. I yield to Mr. Kinzinger.
Well, I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I think it's important to point out that the War Powers Resolution, what it really does, it requires the President to notify Congress within 48 hours of committing armed forces to military action, and it forbids them from remaining for more than 60 days without congressional approval. And it also provides a mechanism, as we've experienced here and elsewhere, for a privilege resolution to withdraw troops, and we understand that. It does not, so to say that this simply just reinforces the War Powers Resolution doesn't do that. The President has flexibility, according to the War Powers Resolution, to make decisions on the use of military action, and then Congress is triggered at that point to act. But to preemptively say that we're going to take away the President's ability to even threaten the use of military force because, and now somehow get a diplomatic solution with just economic measures, or to say that the President cannot commit military to any circumstance except rescuing U.S. hostages in Venezuela. I'm all for rescuing U.S. hostages in Venezuela, but I can think of 1,000 other things, scenarios that if I brought up, we'd probably have 100% agreement that that would cause the introduction of U.S. troops. But let's say something happens really quickly. Let's say it's a humanitarian corridor issue, or let's say it has to do with the Russian jets, and we're gone for the next 2 weeks. And if the President needs our vote now because this thing was just signed into law, we would have to come back 48 hours, probably take a couple days to debate, and then vote. So we've now limited the President's ability to act by 5 days, if we're lucky, if we can get everybody back here in that kind of a time. The War Powers Resolution is just fine. It is exactly what we need to handle a situation like this. But this, I believe, is being done because for whatever reason, there's a political consideration. I don't mean that pejoratively to my friend. Mr. Cicilline and I are friends. But I do think that this is unnecessary. And with that, I'll yield back to my friend from Pennsylvania.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I yield the balance.
Well, I think you want to yield the balance of your time to Mr. McCall, the ranking member.
That's what I meant.
I thank the gentleman from Pennsylvania. I know this is well-intentioned, but I have to tell you, I think it's very dangerous. And what I saw down on the border of Venezuela with the chairman were a bunch of babies and young children and mothers and grandmothers who are leaving that country, 50,000 a day for one reason and one reason only, and that's President Maduro, the illegitimate president, and the humanitarian crises he's brought upon his own people. So I think it's important to look at, as Mr. Perry pointed out, who is for this and who is against this? Because I think that's instructive. I can tell you the Ambassador Vecchio came to me trying to stop this. And then the majority agreed to, well, let's just have a hearing and then we'll stop. And they broke that promise. And then they came back and now they're marking this bill up. I've talked to the ambassador from Venezuela. He does not want to see this go forward. I've talked to the ambassador from Colombia. They do not want to see this go forward. The president of Colombia himself said the only thing keeping President Guaido alive and safe is a threat of credible force. Who is for this? Maduro is. The Russians are. The Chinese are. And the Cubans. Let's remember who our enemies are and who our friends are, and it's the people of Venezuela, not our enemies. And I yield back.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can't imagine a more important and salient debate than the one we're having. There is nothing more momentous and consequential in any vote we will ever cast than it is about war and peace. And for too long, frankly, the legislative branch since World War II has found the coward's way out. We criticize the executive branch for its actions, but of course we take no responsibility for it, even though the Constitution is quite clear. Article 1, in my view, couldn't be clearer. Only the legislative branch has the right to decide on war and peace. And by the way, and to marshal the armed forces, commensurate with that decision. If there are imputed powers to Article 2 for the President in his role as Commander-in-Chief, surely there are also commensurate imputed powers in Article 1 for the legislative branch of the United States Congress. Now, I've heard some arguments from my friend from Pennsylvania that startle me. He's given us a stark choice. He says, you're either with the people of Venezuela or you're not. And I guess the subtext of that challenge is if we don't vote for military intervention at some point, we're not. Well, I beg to differ. I don't think that's the choice at all in front of us. I would also argue that reasonable people could reasonably disagree, but frankly, the introduction of U.S. military could backfire. And if it's going to happen, we need this debate. We need the regular process Mr. Cicilline is telling us we need. Otherwise, we might as well have at it. We've got troops we don't know anything about in Niger. We're supporting a war in Yemen Americans don't really want. We're contemplating intervention in South America that, again, Americans don't want. Or at least they don't want without a cogent explanation coming from the elected representatives here in the Congress. So I hope we have more robust debate. But I hardly believe the choice is as stark as my friend from Pennsylvania put it. And I utterly reject the choice he's given us. That is not our choice. The choice in front of us is, will we ever return to regular order constitutionally? Will we take responsibility for sending young men and young women in harm's way? Or will we continue to take the coward's way out, as we have, frankly, since World War II? This resolution is a step in the right direction, is a step in restoring responsibility and taking responsibility as the separate but co-equal branch we are supposed to be, and commensurate with the powers explicit and implied in Article 1 of the Constitution of the United States. So I support Mr. Cicilline's resolution, and I thank him for his leadership. And I thank my colleagues on both sides for what I think is a vital and consequential debate about the deployment of U.S. force. I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I recognize myself and yield Mr. Cicilline as much time as he may need.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to just say at the outset, the argument that was just made by my friends on the other side of the aisle, that the President of the United States can do whatever he wants for 60 days, is absolutely false. The War Powers Act only triggers a 60-day period once the President has engaged the military, and he can only do so, according to 1541C, in three circumstances. The President may only exercise pursuant to a declaration of war, a specific statutory authorization, or a national emergency created by attack upon the United States, its territories, or its armed forces. So it's only if the President acts pursuant to one of those three conditions that the 60-day clock is triggered. And so this notion that the President can actually do whatever he wants is very disturbing to hear, because Article 1 vests that responsibility in Congress. So I want to correct that record. That is a false assertion that the President is permitted and that this bill narrows in any way the President's authority. This mirrors the exact language of the War Powers Act, this resolution. So it doesn't narrow the President's ability at all. That's number one. Number two, I always am alarmed when I hear what heads of other foreign governments shaping American foreign policy. There are just as many people who believe that Maduro uses this threat of military action by the United States in propaganda to rally people in his country to his side. The threat, when you consider U.S. history in this region of the world. So there are lots of very smart military and diplomatic thinkers who think it is essential that Congress reassert its authority in this moment. And with respect to the question I never got to answer that Mr. Yoho asked, this is about fundamental question of war and peace, whether or not the Congress of the United States is going to fulfill its responsibility and have a serious debate and be accountable for what we decide. And all of the other countries that have been involved in this have managed to play a productive role, the Lima Group, the Europeans, without the threat of military force. And you know what would be especially wonderful? If the world, the Venezuelan people and the world watched the United States honor its Constitution, honor the rule of law, as we're promoting democracy in Venezuela, act democratic here in America, and not violate our Constitution, not surrender our responsibilities as member of Congress. Let's show them by example that we debate tough issues, that Congress in the Constitution is given this responsibility, and we meet the responsibility. Let's model really good behavior as a vibrant and strong democracy and not surrender the authority that Congress has by our Constitution and by the great people of this country. And so I thank the gentleman for yielding and yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman, and I yield back. Is there any further discussion on the bill? Seeing none, are there amendments at the desk?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Sherman is recognized. Clerk will please report the amendment.
Sherman Amendment Number 1, amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1004. Amendment Section 2C to read as follows. Role of construction.
I move we dispense with reading of that amendment.
Without objection, Mr. Sherman is recognized.
The bill is perhaps controversial. I think it's well thought out and necessary. Hopefully this amendment will not be controversial. If you like the bill, this makes it better. If you don't like the bill, this makes it better. It just clarifies a few things. First, it makes it plain that nothing in this bill is an authorization or a direction to the President to send military force into Venezuela. If the President was listening to this debate, I think that would be apparent to him in any case. Second, rule of construction is it provides that this bill does not prevent efforts solely for the purpose of rescuing United States citizens in Venezuela. With that, I would hope that this would be regarded as a non-controversial amendment and move forward quickly. I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Is there further debate on the amendment? Question is on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there other amendments? Any other requests for recognition? Seeing none. Question is on the amendment in the nature of the substitute. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman,
Gentleman is recognized.
I request a recorded vote.
Roll call vote is ordered. Clerk will please call the roll.
Those guys back here.
Mr. Sherman.
Aye.
Mr. Sherman votes aye. Mr. Meeks. Mr. Sires. Aye. Mr. Sires votes aye. Mr. Connolly.
Aye.
Mr. Connolly votes aye. Mr. Deutsch. Aye. Mr. Deutsch votes aye. Ms. Bass. Mr. Keating.
Mr. Keating.
Yeah, aye.
Mr. Keating votes aye. Mr. Cicilline.
Aye.
Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Barra.
Aye.
Mr. Barra votes aye. Mr. Castro. Mr. Castro votes aye. Ms. Titus. Mr. Espaillat. Mr. Espaillat votes aye. Mr. Liu. Mr. Liu votes aye. Ms. Wild. Ms. Wild votes aye. Mr. Phillips. Mr. Phillips votes aye. Ms. Omar. Ms. Omar votes aye. Mr. Allred. Mr. Allred votes aye. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin votes aye. Ms. Spamberger. Ms. Spamberger votes aye. Ms. Houlihan. Ms. Houlihan votes aye. Mr. Malinowski. Mr. Malinowski votes aye. Mr. Trone. Mr. Trone votes aye. Mr. Costa. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Mr. McCall.
No.
Mr. McCall votes no. Mr. Smith. No. Mr. Smith votes no. Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry votes no. Mr. Yoho. Mr. Yoho votes no.
So
Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kingsner votes no. Mr. Zeldin. Mr. Zeldin votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner. Ms. Wagner. Ms. Wagner votes no. Mr. Mast. Mr. Mast votes no. Mr. Rooney.
I was here for this one.
Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Okay.
Mr. Curtis. Mr. Curtis votes no. Mr. Buck. Mr. Wright. Mr. Wright votes no. Mr. Rustenthaler. Mr. Rustenthaler votes no. Mr. Burchett. Mr. Burchett votes no. Mr. Pence. Mr. Pence votes no. Mr. Watkins. Mr. Guest. Mr. Guest votes no. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman votes aye. Oh,
Are there any other members who have not been recorded?
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah. Okay.
Mr. Meeks.
Oh.
Vote aye.
Mr. Meeks votes aye. Mr. Costa. Mr. Costa votes aye. I know.
Are there any other members? Ms. Titus? Mr. Wilson, how is Mr. Wilson recorded?
Mr. Wilson is not recorded. Mr. Wilson votes no.
Mr. Chairman?
How is Ms. Titus
Ms.
recorded?
Titus is not recorded.
Yes.
Ms. Titus votes aye.
Mr. Watkins?
Mr. Watkins votes no.
Anybody else? Okay, the clerk will report the tally.
Yeah, it's basically this. Are any other members? Do any other members recognize?
You can speak on just, I know that we're talking
Adriano, you want to get involved in the Queen's election?
Yeah, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there are 25 ayes and 17 noes.
25 ayes and 17 noes. The amendment is agreed to. The question is to report the bill H.R. 1004, prohibiting unauthorized action in Venezuela Act, to the House, as amended with the recommendation that the bill do pass. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The question is to report the bill H.R. 1004, prohibiting unauthorized action in Venezuela Act, to the House. As amended, no, there's no, okay, sorry, scratch it. The measure is ordered favorably, reported as amended. Okay, are we doing this? Pursuant to notice for purposes of markup, I now call up H.R. 9, the Climate Action Now Act. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 9, to direct the President to develop a plan for the United States to meet its nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement and for other purposes, be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America and Congress assembled. Section 1, short title. This act may be cited as the Climate Action Now Act. Section 2, findings.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. Without objection, the bill shall be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. And at this time, I recognize myself to speak on the legislation. I will keep my remarks brief. Just last week, we had an impressive panel of military, defense, and international development experts testify about how climate change is a direct threat to the national security of the United States. This isn't news. We've known it for decades. Climate change is a grave threat that transcends borders, and when we face pressing global security issues, the United States is strongest when we work shoulder to shoulder with our friends and partners around the world. That's why the Paris Agreement was such a defining moment for the future of our planet. The countries of the world came together to face this global crisis. At times like these, the world usually looks to the United States for leadership. So when President Trump announced his intention to withdraw from his landmark agreement, it showed the world that America is on the retreat. I think it was wrong. Every nation in the world has signed on to this agreement. If we withdraw, we will be the only country unwilling to step up to this challenge. What does that say about America's role in the world? So we must do better because we are already seeing the consequences of our inaction. Natural disasters, famines, instability, human suffering. The time for action to avoid the worst effects of climate change is rapidly closing. We must demonstrate to the rest of the world and to future generations that we're still committed to taking on this fight. So today our committee is considering legislation to address this issue and reassert American leadership on the world stage. The Climate Action Now Act keeps the United States in the Paris Climate Accord, renewing our country's pledge to address climate change head-on. The Paris Agreement allows every country to determine its own emission reduction targets and to develop a public plan for how to meet these targets. This bill follows that same model. It gives the administration total flexibility to decide what approach we need to follow and what kind of technology we need to use to reach our national targets. H.R. 9 gives all of us an opportunity to show Americans that we hear them, that we take their concerns seriously, and that we are taking action to ensure a healthier, safer, and more sustainable future. This should not be a partisan issue. I strongly support this measure, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. And I'll now recognize our ranking member, Mr. McCall of Texas, for any remarks he might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We can all agree that the climate is changing, as Secretary Pompeo testified to, and that we need to take positive steps to address it. However, I oppose H.R. 9 because, among other problems, it attempts to codify President Obama's greenhouse gas reduction pledge under the Paris Agreement. During last week's hearing on climate change, I was encouraged that both sides of the political aisle expressed a shared understanding of the national security threat of climate change. Witnesses invited by both Democrats and Republicans testified to the importance of technology and innovation to address the challenge. However, the bill before us does nothing to bolster research or promote innovation. Instead, it recommits the United States to President Obama's pledge under the Paris Agreement, which was submitted on behalf of the United States without any role of the Congress. We were not even so much as consulted about his pledge to cut greenhouse gases by 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. The private sector was also not meaningfully consulted. And not only that, but as Mr. Worthington, the executive director of the U.S. Energy Association, testified to, the administration provided no cost-benefit analysis or economic justification to rationalize its pledge. All we have to rely on are third-party analysis, one of which found that his commitments would cost the economy $250 billion in gross domestic product and 2.7 million jobs by 2025. Furthermore, when asked by Mr. Zeldin at last week's hearing whether President Obama should have submitted the Paris Agreement to the Senate for ratification, all four witnesses unanimously, including the three invited by the Democrat majority, agreed that he should have. Meanwhile, China, the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter, will continue to increase its emissions through 2030 under its Paris Agreement pledge. The United States, on the other hand, saw a 14% reduction from 2005 to 2017. So instead of doubling down on a pledge that Congress had no role in setting, that will have an unknown and potentially catastrophic impact on the United States economy, and which will do nothing to address China's growing emissions, I believe that we should work on a bipartisan bill to boost research, advance technology, promote innovation, and develop some real solutions. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. McCall. The gentleman yields back. I realize members wish to speak on the bill and that some members have amendments to offer. If members have general remarks on the bill first, we should hear those now and then move on to amendments. Is there anyone who has general remarks on the bill? Mr. Espaillat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Effects of climate change are evident today in more extreme temperatures and more frequent and more intense natural disasters. And many studies and reports affirm a simple fact. Both the causes and effects of climate change have been impacting already vulnerable communities at greater and disproportionate level. lower income communities, indigenous people, communities of color, agrarian, and other marginalized communities not only are bearing the brunt of the impacts of climate change, but these communities are also have lower capacity to prepare for and cope with extreme weather and climate-related events endangering their health and well-being. The people of the Caribbean have faced year-long drought and catastrophic hurricanes that are decimating agriculture. The Northern Triangle faces an extreme dry corridor causing food shortages and further affecting migration trends. Across Asia, rising sea levels threaten island communities, and in southern Africa, shifts in rain patterns strain agricultural production, leading to malnutrition and multiplying the threat of armed conflict and extremism. But it's not just happening to other countries. In my district, Mr. Chairman, black and brown children are experiencing worsening asthma because of increased heat and pollution. Parents come to my office looking for help for their health care and they cannot afford it. This is a local and global issue, and I'm glad that the Foreign Affairs Committee today has demonstrated that we understand the need to address climate change with global solutions. We must incorporate climate justice into all of our policies as we move forward. Every piece of legislation on climate change considered by this House, in every bill we pass and in every hearing we hold, we must ensure that climate justice is addressed. We proactively work to protect the most vulnerable among us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the remaining part of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Is there anyone else who wishes to speak on the bill? Ms. Wild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gandhi once said that a breach of a promise is a surrender of truth. The United States abandoning the Paris Agreement is nothing short of a surrender. Our allies are watching. Our adversaries are watching. We have an opportunity here to fulfill a promise that nearly 200 other countries have made and honored. We also have an opportunity to resurrect the truth about climate change, that it is based on objective scientific evidence and that the United States carbon footprint has contributed to this crisis. We can seize those opportunities by voting in favor of H.R. 9 today. On December 12, 2015, the United States joined nearly 200 countries in signing the Paris Agreement to combat climate change. As part of that agreement, the United States adopted a plan to reduce its carbon pollution by 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. Today, we stand as the only country that has withdrawn from that global pact, the only country. And even as some refuse to acknowledge the reality of the climate crisis, our country continues to pay the price of extreme natural disasters that grow in force and frequency, which cause loss of life, destruction of infrastructure, and damage to our economy. It should not take one more record-breaking flood or wildfire or hurricane or drought to do what is right. Enough is enough. In order to make good on our commitment, it is imperative that we prohibit federal funds from being used to take any action to advance the withdrawal of the United States from the Paris Agreement. It is also imperative that we call on the administration to develop and make public a concrete plan for how the United States will meet the pollution reduction goals submitted to the world in 2015. Anything short of passing H.R. 9 is a signal to our allies that we are unreliable, a signal to our adversaries that we cede this space to them, and an abdication of our most solemn duty to keep our constituents safe. Thank you. I yield back.
Would my friend yield for a question behind you?
Yes.
I thank the gentlelady from Pennsylvania. I was listening intently to what she had to say, and I thought you said we're the only nation now not a party to the Paris Climate Accord. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So when President Trump pulled us out, we at least had company in Nicaragua and Syria.
That is correct.
And now you tell me that they've both joined. So we don't even have Nicaragua and Syria to keep us company. Is that correct?
My esteemed colleague, I don't know when Nicaragua decided to rejoin, but Syria ended its holdout in 2017.
Wow. What a lonely place to be. I thank my friend.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
Are there any other members? Mr. Yoho.
Yeah, I'm in opposition to this. And, again, I think politics are being played on this. The United States, thank God, is the only country that pulled out of this because they did show leadership. As Chairman McCall or Ranking Member McCall pointed out, from 2005 to 2017, carbon emissions in the United States of America has gone down 14%. Our production and manufacturing has gone up. Our energy consumption went down 2%. That's leadership. China's commitment to this was, we'll try. Yet it's going to tie the hands of the American consumers to pay for China trying as they pollute. They're putting on coal plant after coal plant after coal plant around the world, not just in China, but in other countries, increasing the CO2 footprint. We've got LNG coming out of this country that is leading an energy revolution, driving down the CO2 cost. And, this whole discussion over climate change, nobody's in denial that it's happening, but it's the cause of why it's happening. And if you look at the anthropogenic effect, yeah, I'm sure humans have contributed to it. But if you look at the natural causes, over 51% of it, according to science, since we are so hell-bent on science, is coming from solar activity. I don't believe you're going to stop that. And so to have a bill coming out basically attacking the president for pulling out of the climate deal, I think is pure politics, and it's below the bipartisanship of this committee, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Is there any other member that wishes to speak on either side? Yes, Mr. Mast.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just also want to point out, as we discussed this, that many of the members of this committee were not present when we had Secretary Tillerson here discussing the Paris Climate Accord, discussing how the United States of America doesn't simply contribute billions of dollars to a program and just leave the conversation, just give up those resources and say, no, we're not going to play a role in this. We're not going to see what happens to those dollars. Go off and do with it whatever you like. That's not what occurs with this. In fact, we're still present at every conversation having to do with the Paris Climate Accord. We're still actively engaged in this. We've just made it a point to say, listen, you're not going to get our money and our resources and give us no more say than the people, the countries that are the least contributors to these programs. Very, very specifically pointed out by Secretary Tillerson at the time that he came here. And I would point out that many were not present for that conversation. With that, I yield back to our ranking member.
Are there any other members? Mr. Wright, did you have your hand up?
I did have a comment on the bill, Mr. Chairman, and that is I sense some incongruity with my friends on the other side. We just finished a markup on a bill because Democrats are afraid of what President Trump might do unilaterally, but it didn't seem to bother you when President Obama did things unilaterally, like this Paris Accord, without submitting it to the Senate. And the reason there was Republican opposition to it then and now is it placed the United States of America at a distinct economic disadvantage vis-a-vis other countries in the world. Now, why any president or any Congress would want to place our own country at an economic disadvantage is mind-boggling, and that's why I will certainly be voting no on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back. Anyone else? Let's now move to amendments. Is there anyone that wishes to submit an amendment?
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. McCall?
I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk, and I ask for its consideration at this time.
The clerk will please report the amendment.
McCall, Amendment Number 1, amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 9 offered by Mr. McCall. Strike all after the enacting clause and insert...
Mr. Chairman, I dispense with the reading request.
Without objection, a further reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. A point of order is reserved. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to say from the outset, echoing what Mr. Mast indicated, and that is that we never pulled out of the Paris Agreement. We are still under the Paris Agreement, the President just signaled his intention to possibly pull out in the future if it wasn't fixed. My amendment simply requires any new U.S. commitments under Paris come to Congress along with an economic analysis. It recognizes a government policy that enjoys broad bipartisan support is needed to address the challenge of climate change, including policies that promote private sector-led innovation and technological advancement. It requires that President Obama's pledge to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025 be accomplished by an economic justification and cost-benefit analysis, which his administration never provided to the Congress. It also requires any future commitments by the United States to be subjected to congressional notification and include detailed information about the economic impact of such commitments, including what it will mean for the poor, for world energy markets, for our economic competitiveness, and for the United States' national security interests. Under the Paris Agreement, the United States is just one of 12 countries out of the top 100 emitters to have no meaningful role for its legislature to provide input on our pledges. The President alone should not have that power to unilaterally reduce our emissions by 2025 when China, the world's top emitter, won't do the same until 2030. In short, my amendment calls for a bipartisan approach to addressing climate change, including technology and innovation. It adds a role for Congress and ensures that our commitments are based on economic reality. I urge support, and with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Is there further debate on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Keating. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I speak in opposition to this amendment. The principal purpose of the Climate Action Now Act is to keep the United States in the Paris Climate Accord. This amendment fails to accomplish this most basic task, and for that reason alone, I oppose it. As you know, the Paris Agreement is the first truly universal agreement among nations to tackle climate change. Rarely is there consensus among nearly all nations on any topic, but with the Paris Agreement, leaders from around the world collectively agreed that climate change is driven by human behavior, that it's a threat to the environment and all of humanity, and that global action is needed to stop it. It's also created a clear framework for all countries to make emission reduction commitments. At present, 197 countries, every nation on the earth, with the last signatory being war-torn Syria, have adopted the Paris Agreement. If we follow through, as the President has announced, we'll be the only country on earth unwilling to step up to this challenge. The U.S. has retreated from leadership positions. With this amendment, we're retreating from even followership positions. It'd be a terrible shame if we followed this President, ignored the threats of climate change, and ceded our role on the global stage to other countries. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Is there further debate on the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment. All those in Mr. McCall's amendment, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. McCall.
No, I request a recorded vote.
A roll call vote is ordered, and the clerk will please call the roll.
Mr. Sherman. Mr. Meeks. Mr. Sires. Mr. Sires votes no. Mr. Connolly. Mr. Deutsch. Ms. Bass. Mr. Keating. Mr. Keating votes no. Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Barra. Mr. Barra votes no. Mr. Castro? Ms. Titus? Mr. Espaillat? Mr. Espaillat votes no. Mr. Liu? Mr. Liu votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Phillips? Mr. Phillips votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Allred? Mr. Allred votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Spamberger? Ms. Spamberger votes no. Ms. Houlihan? Ms. Houlihan votes no. Mr. Malinowski? Mr. Malinowski votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Mr. Costa? Mr. Costa votes no. Mr. Vargas? Mr. Vargas votes no. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez votes no. Mr. McCall?
Aye.
Mr. McCall votes aye. Mr. Smith? Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Wilson? Mr. Perry? Mr. Perry votes aye. Mr. Yoho? Mr. Yoho votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger? Mr. Kinzinger votes aye. Mr. Zeldin? Mr. Zeldin votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mrs. Wagner? Mrs. Wagner votes aye. Mr. Mast? Mr. Mast votes aye. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Fitzpatrick? Mr. Curtis? Mr. Curtis votes aye. Mr. Buck? Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Rushenthaler? Mr. Rushenthaler votes aye. Mr. Burchett? Mr. Burchett votes aye. Mr. Pence? Mr. Pence votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Guest? Mr. Guest votes aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman votes no.
Is there anyone who has not been recorded who would like to do so? How is Mr. Connolly recorded?
Mr. Connolly is not recorded. Mr. Connolly votes no.
Mr. Deutsch, how is Mr. Deutsch recorded?
Mr. Deutsch is not recorded. Mr. Deutsch votes no.
Anybody else? Oh, Mr. Wilson.
Mr. Wilson votes aye.
Okay, if there are no other votes, clerk will report the tally. Clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 16 ayes and 21 noes.
16 ayes and 21 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. Do other members seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk, and I ask for its consideration at this time.
Mr. Curtis. The gentleman has 5 minutes.
Oh, no, wait, the clerk will read the.
Oh, clerk, I'm sorry, clerk will read. Okay.
Oh.
Sorry. Vote is over. The vote's over. Yeah, it's over. It's good try.
Oh, well.
Where are we? The clerk will report the amendment?
Okay, the clerk will report the amendment.
Curtis Amendment Number 1. Page 4, after line 23, insert the following paragraph.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we dispense with the reading of the amendment.
Without objection, further reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. A point of order is reserved. Mr. Curtis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would simply note the nationally determined contributions, like greenhouse gas emissions of the United States compared with those of other countries. This includes China, which in the 2015 Paris Agreement has actually been permitted to increase emissions to the year 2030. As we engage in the debate about climate change, I believe it is important to note that over the past decade, the U.S. has decreased annual carbon dioxide emissions by hundreds of millions of tons, while in the last 20 years, China has tripled its carbon dioxide emissions. Without a level playing field and accountability from high emissions countries like China, the United States' efforts to reduce emissions will have little, if any, effect on the planet overall. I urge my colleagues to adopt this common sense amendment to improve transparency, and I yield my time.
The gentleman yields back his time. Is there further debate on the amendment? Mr. Malinowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll speak in opposition to the amendment. It sounds to me as if all of us here, or most of us, recognize that climate change is a serious issue, a serious threat to our economy, our national security, to our well-being. The vast majority of Americans believe that and believe that we need to do something about it. In many states, including my own, New Jersey, state governments have set very ambitious goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I think we also all agree that there is absolutely nothing that the United States can do alone to meet this threat if large developing economies like China don't do their part. So wouldn't it be great if there were an international agreement that imposed no requirements on the United States apart from those that we voluntarily commit to, while also requiring large developing economies like China to, for the very first time, make commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions themselves? Wait a second, we have that. It's the Paris Accords. That is the function of the Paris Accords. It's not to require anything of the United States other than what we've committed to, because the commitments are strictly voluntary. But for the very, very first time, China has said what it plans to do, and it's entirely transparent because we know exactly what commitments they've made. And in fact, China has committed that by 2030, it will reduce carbon emissions per unit of GDP by 60 to 65% from 2005 levels to 2030. And despite being the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter, China has created the world's largest carbon market, pumped 3 times as much money into renewables as the United States, surpassed us in terms of both the number of electric vehicles on the road, the number of available charging stations. So my worry is not that we are somehow letting China off the hook, because we're not. My worry is that China is actually poised to beat us in the race to a clean energy future, with all of the economic implications that will have. That China is taking advantage of our inexplicable decision to withdraw from Paris, to seize the mantle of global leadership on this issue. And so this bill simply says we do not cede leadership to anybody. We are not going to be the only country that pulls out of the Paris Accord and allow China to basically lord it over us in the international community, to say we're doing something and the Americans are not. And it very simply asks the President to tell us how we're going to meet the commitments, and it allows him to do it in whatever way he chooses. Let's keep this bill simple. Let's remain a global leader. I'm opposed to this amendment for that reason. And I yield.
Any further comments on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes. Mr. Zeldin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to speak in support of the gentleman's amendment. I think we have some different takes with regards to exactly what China and some other countries are agreeing to. My concern with the Paris Agreement was with the reality that China is the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter, but for the first 13 years of the deal, they're agreeing to continue to increase emissions. And you can actually give China more credit than India. But just to recap, each nation under the Paris Agreement can do whatever they want to reach a long-term goal. The only thing India and China are committed to at the international level is to issue a report to the UN on their climate mitigation efforts next year, and to keep up the reporting every 5 years. There's no enforcement mechanism. Both nations have issued carbon mitigation plans to reach the vague targets of the Paris Accords that require them to drastically take coal-fired power plants offline. And since China has an authoritarian, centrally planned economy, they're making some progress. India is not, and it's an election year. So any efforts to rework their reliance on coal are on pause until at least their election is over later this year. With regards to the other countries around the world, they aren't stepping up to the plate, and we have a concern with that. I would love to see the United States be in a position to enter into a deal where other countries contributing to this issue are stepping up like we are. Now, we've seen a significant reduction in emissions over the course of about a dozen years. You look at the numbers between about 2005 and 2017. That's why I was grateful of the lead Republican, Mr. McCall's amendment as well. I think it's important to be engaging the private sector in technology, and let's do it on an international level. Let's talk about economic concerns in our nation just like they can talk about economic concerns in theirs. As we're setting our own commitment, concerned about our country, we need to be concerned about energy costs, but this bill doesn't make any reference to the costs that are going to go up on my constituents. And I wish that it had, and that's why I was grateful for Mr. McCall's amendment. But I just feel like as far as the agreement in total, that these other nations that are doing so much to contribute to this problem really should have stepped up more than they did. And additionally, I think it's greatly concerning that Congress didn't have a role to play in this process. You had other countries, the EU and I mean other nations in their legislatures, they would have debates over this. Some would have votes. Some of them would involve their nation's population. Here, President Obama unilaterally agreed to a deal where China was agreeing to increase emissions for the next 13 years. I believe that China should have done more. I believe that India should have been committed to do more. There are other nations that should have been committing to do more, and actually some made commitments that they're not going to obtain that were unreasonable. I mean, what about that? I mean, with a straight face, when you look at a commitment being made by the EU where we know that there's no way that they're going to meet their target, that's also something that should be debated here in Congress. I also believe it should have been submitted as a treaty, but I'd like to yield to Mr. Yoho.
And I just want to remind people that China has made a lot of commitments. If we look at the commitment of not militarizing the Spratly or Parsley Islands while they were in the Rose Garden with President Obama, committed not to do that at the same time they were doing it. They committed to allow Hong Kong to remain an autonomous region for 50 years, but 22 years into it, Xi Jinping says, as far as he's concerned, it's null and void. And so I'm not concerned with what China's doing. I look at America's leadership and what we're doing in reducing the footprint of CO2. I yield back to the gentleman. Thank you for.
Yeah, and I think it's very important for us to be able to enter into a good deal for the United States. That should be our goal. What's the best deal that we can get for the United States? And I would argue that we could have gotten a better deal. And I would encourage whoever the president is now, whoever the next president is, whoever else is serving here in Congress, that this is an important topic for us and future Congresses and future presidents to be debating. We should just try to get more results from the countries that are contributing the most to the issue. And the United States has been leading, and we should continue to lead. Other nations need to do their part. Yield back.
The gentleman yield back. Is there further debate? Mr. Connolly for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair. I got to say my head is spinning. First, we have a Republican Party here in the Congress that by and large has consistently denied climate change. We were looking at the international affairs section of the President's budget, and in 140 pages, he makes reference to climate change once. Once. Now we hear from our friend from New York. His criticism is not that we're doing something about climate change, but that others aren't doing enough. And I wonder if the irony of that position strikes anyone else. It certainly struck me. If that's your critique, we're happy to join in. And my friend from New York ended his remarks by saying, the United States is doing its share, others ought to follow. Well, actually, as the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania pointed out, the United States is the only country of 197 that's not a member, a signatory to the Paris Climate Accord. So you can't have it both ways. If you want to really toughen things up, we're happy to join you. But first, we got to participate in the Paris Climate Accord, or we give away all moral authority, as President Trump did. And my friend from Florida, Mr. Yoho, brought up a lot of issues regarding China, and I would probably join him in most of those issues, but they have very little to do with the bill in front of us at the moment. I guess when we can't make the argument about the substance of climate change, we revert to other behavior we don't like. But the fact of the matter is, our own military, the IPCC, an intergovernmental committee of this administration are unanimous in looking at the threats of global warming and the very alarming rise, unprecedented in 800,000 years, of CO2. It's going to affect our way of life, our children and our grandchildren. And at some point, maybe we can get off the talking points, maybe we can get off the ideological precepts that bind us in straitjackets and think about future generations and our obligation to them. I oppose the amendment on those grounds. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Congressman Perry wants to be heard.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's my understanding that our friends Turkey and Russia have not ratified the agreement either, but with that, I'll turn my time over to or yield to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Zeldin.
Thank you, and I appreciate the gentleman from Virginia's attempt to put words in my mouth and to speak for me and for other members on our side of the aisle. We think for ourselves over here. We're not cheap just to do whatever others in our party state. We have difference of opinion. We debate them. We share our ideas, and certain things that we have a problem with, that I, speaking for myself, have a problem with, is that these other nations are not stepping up and doing their part. I have a problem of what the economic consequence is going to be for a constituent of mine who is really struggling to be able to pay their bills. We should be talking about the economics of the proposal. I think it's a fair point as members of Congress. We just had a debate on an amendment with regards to the use of force in Venezuela. And the gentleman from Virginia was passionately talking about how Congress should take back their Article I powers and how important it is for Congress to step up and not cede our power to the executive branch. And then the next bill that comes up, the gentleman from Virginia is here passionately talking about how important it is for this chamber to cede our power to the executive branch. There's no concern at all that Congress has no role to play whatsoever with the negotiation and entry into this agreement without coming to Congress, without consulting us? Or what about us as Republicans and Democrats working together? Chairman Engel has stated for years I've been able to serve on this committee. Chairman Royce before him, Mike McCall. Members on both sides of the aisle wanted to talk, Republicans and Democrats, about how we can move forward with our nation's foreign policy. There are so many issues that are before our country that are so important. This is one that there's a valid amendment being offered. You can oppose it, you can support it, but don't put words in my mouth. We have important concerns with regards to the Paris Agreement. I believe that we can enter into a better deal. I have a district that's almost completely surrounded by water on the east end of Long Island. I would encourage the gentleman from Virginia to come visit. We have great wineries on the North Fork. It's a great place to come, especially between Memorial Day and Labor Day. We could talk about rising sea levels. We could talk about what we can do to improve water quality, to improve air quality. We might not agree on all of the solutions, but let's talk about it. But right now with this particular debate, this conversation, whether this amendment, the bill at large, Mr. McCall's amendment, I don't think that we should be insulted for not all agreeing with each other in this committee, having a difference of opinion between the legislative branch and the executive branch. I think the disagreement is healthy. But let's not put words into each other's mouth, and instead let's talk about solutions. I think that there are companies that have new technologies where we can figure out ways to reduce emissions without the executive branch, or maybe even without the legislative branch, forcing that company to make that change. We should have a conversation as to why emissions went down between 2005 and 2017. What went right? What are some companies doing better? I would look forward to an opportunity to work with the gentleman from Virginia as opposed to just debating him here in this. And I'm not going to attempt to put words in his mouth. But, you want to talk about irony. Using the words that came out of his mouth from one speech to the next, from one bill to the next, about whether or not we should be ceding our power or taking advantage of our Article I powers. This agreement should have been submitted to the Senate as a treaty. And when I posed that question to all four witnesses, including the three Democratic witnesses who were here, they all agreed that this should have been submitted to the Senate as a treaty. But there was a philosophy of the last administration. When we asked them about the Iran nuclear deal, if you remember, there were a few members here who asked Secretary Kerry, why was this not submitted to Congress? Why was it not submitted to the Senate as a treaty? And his answer was that they would not have been able to get it passed. And I don't think that's a good excuse, whether it's the last administration, the current administration, or the next. There's a lot of debate to be had over the course of the next 2 years, and whoever the next, what the American people decide who the president is going to be for the next 4 years, the next 4 years after that, and whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, this is an issue that's going to outlast every single one of us in this chamber. And I think a lot of people at home and across this country would appreciate it if we could find a way to do a better job working together on this important issue of climate change.
Congressman Levin is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to say a few things about this situation, about China and some of these arguments. First of all, the main thing that happened between 2005 and 2012 is called the Great Recession, and that's the main reason why our greenhouse gas emissions went down. Also, some of us in the States moved forward on energy efficiency and renewable energy standards while this body didn't do much to advance the ball. So we had some leadership from the states. In terms of China, first of all, we have to look at the history of carbon emissions. Even in 2100, even with China's growing economy, and I agree, over-reliance on coal, 20% of cumulative greenhouse gas emissions will come from this country and have come from this country in 2100, 17% from the European Union and 12% from China, even then. So we have contributed much more of the problem. We will have even many years hence. But on another level, I don't care what China does. I care about American leadership. And as Mr. Malinowski says, I care about our leadership in the economy. We are being left behind on high-speed rail, on electrification of vehicles, on the deployment of solar and wind and offshore wind, and on energy storage and on microgrids and so many other fronts. This is going to be the next 50 years of fortunes in global capitalism. We are being left behind because we're scared. We're scared to lead. We're scared to just admit the reality of science. There's no debate over how much of greenhouse gas emissions are caused by human activity. There's no real scientific debate over this. Let's go. Let's reestablish American leadership. The Paris Accords are a faint first step of what we need to do. And my kids, for one, are not going to let us sit around here and debate endlessly. They want action. We need to get on with passing this, and then we need to take a lot of concrete steps to reduce our carbon emissions and show American leadership on the new sustainable economy that is to come. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Friend, yield.
My brother, I yield to you.
I thank the gentleman from Michigan. You know, the gentleman from New York accuses people of putting words in his mouth. That isn't what happened. The accusation wasn't that he spoke words that, in fact, he didn't. It was that one's head was spinning over trying to follow the logic on the other side of the aisle. Does anyone here really believe that the amendments we're going to consider and have considered to this bill are designed to improve it? They are, in fact, designed to derail the bill. They are designed to slow this down. And that is a consistent pattern of our friends on the other side of the aisle when it comes to this subject. I don't remember my friend from New York complaining when the President of the United States denied climate change, denied the recommendations of his own intergovernmental panel, denied the findings of the IPCC. It's not putting words in your mouth. It's holding you to account for a very sorry record of empirical denial about a subject that's going to affect every person and every living thing on this planet. It is consequential to withdraw from an international agreement we helped spearhead. Yeah, maybe it should have been a treaty. I hardly believe that's a dispositive issue. Got to begin somewhere. Why not begin as an agreement? And I find it ironic that the charge is made that the previous administration left out the Congress. I seem to recall a delegation of us getting ready to go on an airplane to Paris to celebrate the signing of the agreement that was blocked by the Republican Speaker of the House of Representatives, so that no one from Congress on the House side was able to go and celebrate that moment. It's been a deliberate, consistent pattern of science denial and deflection rather than deal with the subject. And one wonders why. I thank my friend from Michigan for yielding.
Gentleman's time has expired. Are there any other members who wish to be heard?
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Deutsch.
Move to strike the last word. Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to respond to one thing that we heard, which is this idea that this is an issue that we can debate today, but whatever we do today, we're going to be debating it through the end of this administration and the next administration and administrations that come after that. Where is the urgency from my colleagues on this issue? This is not an issue that can wait 2 years and 4 years and 8 years and 12 years. It will be too late. That's why it's so important for us to move forward. I support the Climate Action Now Act. I applaud the work of Representative Castor, the chair of the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. As Floridians, Representative Castor and I know the impact of climate change because it's happening right now. That's why we need action right now. Not next year, not after the next election, not after 4 more presidential elections. It will be too late. When will we sense the urgency? How many warmest years on record do we have to endure before there is finally some acknowledgement that this is a crisis? The whole world came together in Paris to make commitments that would respond to the threat of climate change. Under this administration, America has now turned its back on those commitments, turned its back on the world, and turned its back on the future generations who will not have the luxury of a decision point. That's where we are now. It is our decision that we are making for them, and we've got to get it right. That's why I support Representative Castor's work as the chair of the Select Committee. I support her strong legislation to bring us back to the global stage, to bring us back to our commitments to take action on climate change and to do it right now. And I also like to take this moment to extend an invitation. I'd like to invite my Republican colleagues to join the bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus. We've got to move climate change beyond politics. I agree with that. And I thank the 45 Republicans who joined this bipartisan dialogue on the real threats and possible solutions last Congress. And I invite all of my Republican colleagues to join me and my co-chair, Francis Rooney, in this Congress to move forward. It's important to have bipartisan conversations. The fact is that alternative energy companies that will secure our energy future need to be part of those conversations. So do energy companies who are working hard on sustainability, and military experts who have warned of the threats of climate migration and famine and drought. Scientists who have measured the impact on local economies from regional impacts that are happening today across the country. Fortune 500 companies who are already doing their part to reduce their carbon footprint. Last year, several caucus members and I drafted a legislative tool to help reduce carbon emissions. And I'm going to take advantage of this moment to encourage my colleagues to look at the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, which is a companion, should be a companion to this Climate Action Now Act, because it would reduce carbon pollution by 45% by 2030, with an over 90% reduction by 2050. And it would create over 2 million new jobs in a decade. And it would prevent 13,000 pollution-related deaths in the United States annually. The Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act would put a price on pollution. And the fees collected would go back to the American people to ease the transition to a clean, carbon-neutral economy that would be felt by lower-income and middle-income families. That's how we address those concerns. I applaud the committee here for taking up H.R. 9. And I invite my colleagues to join the Climate Solutions Caucus, and I ask them to look at real efforts that would address this crisis right now. That's what our legislation will do. And I go back to where I started. If we don't act now, we're nearing a point of no return when it comes to our environment, when it comes to our health, when it comes to our economy. I strongly support H.R. 9 to recommit us to leadership and to climate action and to doing it right now. I thank the chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Is there anyone else who wishes to be heard on this amendment? Mr. Mast.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I find it amazing that we're having a debate about this without anybody really on either side bringing up a whole lot of the facts on reductions of emissions, where the U.S. stands, where China stands, where India stands, where the EU stands, what's gone on per capita, how many metric tons, what's gone on in the energy sector. So let's talk a little bit about some of the facts that exist out there. U.S., highest decline in CO2 emissions, really in modern history. Now, we still have higher emissions per capita than most others. I'm not going to deny that. That's a fact as well. So per capita, we do use more. But highest decline in emissions from any country out there, 758 million metric tons between 2005 and 2017. At the same period of time, China, up 50%. Their emissions grew by 3 billion metric tons at the same time as ours fell by 758 million metric tons. India, up 88% at the exact same time. So I think we should talk about some of these, talk about where this has occurred in U.S. energy sector. Largely in the U.S. energy sector, this has occurred as a result of the growing, or rather really beginning with the growth in the shale industry in the United States. That's really when that time began, contributing to what happened in our energy sector, going to natural gas. That's what's precipitated most of that decline in the United States. I think as we debate this and we talk about this on both sides, it is important that we throw out some of the numbers related to what the U.S. has actually been going out there and achieving. Not that we should ever sit there and rest on our laurels to date or simply boast of the past. That's not our job to do, but it's important to bring it up as we have this debate. And I yield back.
Will the gentleman yield?
Who asked for that? absolutely. Mr. Curtis, I will yield the remainder of my time to you.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, as the author of this amendment, I'd like to point out that very little of our discussion has actually had to do with my amendment. I suspect it has been good therapy for all of us. And with that in mind, I'd like to indulge in just a little bit of therapy and then perhaps...
Welcome to the Congress, Mr. Curtis.
You know, I feel much like the last bill, there is actually a lot that we agree on here, and we get caught up on some partisan issues. I'd like to remind everybody that the intent of this bill is to measure performance. Those of us who have worked to increase performance in business, in athletics, anything, know that what we measure improves. And that's simply all this amendment is doing, is asked to measure performance and to compare how we're doing. The one gentleman that did actually refer to my amendment discussed competition between China and the United States. I actually think this would introduce a healthy competition between countries. And so with that in mind, Mr. Chairman, I yield my time and hope we can soon vote on my amendment.
The gentleman yields back his time. Anybody else wish to speak? Mr. Phillips.
Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I feel compelled to set the record straight as we talk about our country's performance relative to emissions. The truth is that in 2018, our emissions are projected to increase by 3.4%, an increase, not a decrease, as some on the other side have noted. And at a time when the world desperately needs to decrease emissions, ours are increasing. In a year where more dirty coal plants closed in our country than any other year in history, our emissions are increasing. And that means vast declines in coal use were not enough to offset the other harms that are being caused by this administration, like efforts to weaken standards for ozone pollution, repeal the Clean Power Plan, repeal the Waters of the United States rule, withdraw the mercury effluent rule, eliminate the lead risk reduction program, repeal a rule regulating coal ash, weaken emission standards for brick and tile manufacturers, roll back of vehicle emission standards, withdraw a proposed rule reducing air pollutants at sewage treatment plants, and yes, withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. So for us to pretend that we are a model actor here, in my estimation, is inappropriate. We shouldn't pretend that there's no problem, and I think it's time that we fulfill our responsibility to work with our friends and partners around the world to combat this threat. Therefore, I urge my fellow members to vote no on this amendment. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Any further comments? Seeing none. The question is on the amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
May I ask for a recorded vote?
The roll call vote is ordered, and the clerk will please call the roll.
Mr. Sherman? Mr. Meeks?
No.
Mr. Meeks votes no. Mr. Siras?
No.
Mr. Siras votes no. Mr. Connolly?
Nay.
Mr. Connolly votes no. Mr. Deutsch? Ms. Bass? Ms. Bass votes no. Mr. Keating? Mr. Keating votes no. Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Barra? Mr. Barra votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Ms. Titus? Mr. Espaillat? Mr. Espaillat votes no. Mr. Liu? Mr. Liu votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Phillips? Mr. Phillips votes no. Ms. Omar? Mr. Allred? Mr. Allred votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Spanberger? Ms. Spanberger votes no. Ms. Houlihan? Ms. Houlihan votes no. Mr. Malinowski? Mr. Malinowski votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Mr. Costa? Mr. Costa votes no. Mr. Vargas? Mr. Vargas votes no. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez votes no. Mr. McCall?
Aye.
Mr. McCall votes aye. Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith votes aye. Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry votes aye. Mr. Yoho. Mr. Yoho votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes aye. Mr. Zeldin. Mr. Zeldin votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner votes aye. Mr. Mast. Mr. Mast votes aye. Mr. Rooney. Mr. Fitzpatrick. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Curtis votes aye. Mr. Buck. Mr. Wright. Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Rushenthaler. Mr. Rushenthaler votes aye. Mr. Burchett. Mr. Burchett votes aye. Mr. Pence. Mr. Pence votes aye. Mr. Watkins. Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Guest. Mr. Guest votes aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman votes no.
Are there any others who seek to vote who haven't voted? Mr. Deutsch.
Mr. Deutsch votes no.
Anybody else? Okay, the clerk will tally the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there are 17 ayes and 22 noes.
17 ayes and 22 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. Do other members seek recognition? Mr. Wright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will please report the amendment.
Wright, Amendment Number 1. At the end of the bill, add the following new section. Section 6, effective date. This act takes effect on the date that the...
Without objection, further reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. A point of order is reserved. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment is very simple, and it changes the effective date of H.R. 9 to whenever the Secretary of State can certify that China and Russia are making emission reduction commitments equivalent to those made by the United States. President Obama unilaterally committed us to reducing our emissions by 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. Fulfilling this commitment has the potential, as our ranking member has noted, to reduce U.S. gross domestic product by $250 billion and eliminate 2.7 million American jobs. This makes no sense, however, when you consider that in 2017, when emissions in the rest of the world were increasing, U.S. carbon emissions were the lowest since 1992. Why would we commit to further reducing our emissions at such great cost to our economy and the prosperity of the American people when other countries like Russia, India, and China continue to pollute the earth at unprecedented levels? Before we make additional economic sacrifices to reduce our emissions, we need to see comparable action from the worst greenhouse gas offenders. Otherwise, it's all for nothing. This amendment is not a pullout, it's a delay. Let's stop putting the United States at an economic disadvantage vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Is there further debate on the amendment? Ms. Wild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition to this amendment, which requires China and Russia commit to emissions reductions that are equivalent to the emissions reductions commitments of the United States. But the amendment does not define what equivalent means. Equivalent to what? It's not clear what exactly we're binding ourselves to or expecting from other countries with this amendment. Second, the language appears to suggest that the United States should wait to act until other countries, specifically China and Russia, commit to reduce emissions. Yet those countries have already committed to climate action. This amendment delays the effective date of the bill, wrongly uses China and Russia as excuses for inaction, and risks ceding global leadership on this issue. However, the amendment serves as a reminder that the whole world, including the United States, China, and Russia, need to do more if we are to be spared from the worst impacts of climate change. The Chinese government acknowledged in its most recent comprehensive assessment of climate change that it is already affected by worsening floods, more extreme droughts, diminished fishery productivity, and other ecological changes. It recognizes that a warming climate will threaten the country's agricultural production, make economically important cities vulnerable to flooding, and eventually dry out many of the country's rivers. Under the Paris Agreement, China committed to leveling off its carbon emissions no later than 2030 and reducing carbon emissions per unit of gross domestic product by 60 to 65% from 2005 levels by 2030. Those targets are not as ambitious as ours. Remember, each nation gets to submit its own. But Beijing is acting quite aggressively to reduce emissions and deploy clean energy technologies. Despite being the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter since 2005, China has created the world's largest carbon market, pumped approximately 3 times as much money into renewables as the United States, and surpassed the United States in terms of both the number of electric vehicles on the road and the number of publicly available charging stations. China is also embracing the nexus between climate and security. In 2017, China signed on to a joint statement with the European Union terming rising global temperatures a root cause of instability. And on the global stage, the Trump administration's effective withdrawal from the Paris Agreement has created a global leadership void that China has been keen to exploit. And Russia is the world's 5th largest greenhouse gas emitter and is one of 13 nations that signed the Paris Agreement but still hasn't formally ratified it. Under the Paris Agreement, Russia proposed to reduce emissions 25% to 30% below 1990 levels by 2030. Russia said for years that it would delay ratification until the parties agreed on rules for implementation, which just happened at the 24th Conference of Parties in Poland in December of 2018. And now, according to the Los Angeles Times, Russia is moving closer to ratifying the Paris Climate Agreement later this year. In January, the Russian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs said its members supported ratification, citing concerns over economic restrictions and competitiveness. Russia also recognizes that future trade deals with the EU could be in jeopardy without ratification. The European Commission has said it prefers to deal with countries that back the Paris Accord. A 2017 deal between Japan and the EU specifically referred to implementation of the climate accord. It takes courage to experiment with new ways of doing things and to leave old habits behind. The U.S. has always led on big global challenges, and now we must seize on the commitments from around the world and apply the unmatched strength and ingenuity of the American government and private sector to the problem of combating climate change. This amendment wrongly uses China and Russia as excuses for inaction, and that's why I stand in firm opposition to it. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. Is there further debate on the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I request recorded vote.
A recorded vote, a roll call vote is ordered, and the clerk will please call the roll.
Mr. Sherman? Mr. Meeks?
No.
Mr. Meeks votes no. Mr. Sires? Mr. Sires votes no. Mr. Connolly? Mr. Deutsch? Ms. Bass? Ms. Bass votes no. Mr. Keating? No. Mr. Keating votes no. Mr. Cicilline?
No.
Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Barra. Mr. Barra votes no. Mr. Castro. Mr. Castro votes no. Ms. Titus. Mr. Espaillat. Mr. Espaillat votes no. Mr. Liu. Mr. Liu votes no. Ms. Wild. Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Phillips. Mr. Phillips votes no. Ms. Omar. Mr. Allred. Mr. Allred votes no. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Spanberger. Ms. Spanberger votes no. Ms. Houlihan. Ms. Houlihan votes no. Mr. Malinowski. Mr. Malinowski votes no. Mr. Trone. Mr. Costa. Mr. Costa votes no. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas votes no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez votes no. Mr. McCall.
Aye.
Mr. McCall votes aye. Mr. Smith. Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry votes aye. Mr. Yoho. Mr. Yoho votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes aye. Mr. Zeldin. Mr. Zeldin votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner votes aye. Mr. Mast. Mr. Mast votes aye. Mr. Bruni. Mr. Fitzpatrick. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Curtis votes aye. Mr. Buck. Mr. Buck votes aye. Mr. Wright. Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Rustenthaler. Mr. Burchett. Mr. Burchett votes aye. Mr. Pence. Mr. Pence votes aye. Mr. Watkins. Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Guest. Mr. Guest votes aye. Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman votes no.
Are there any other members that wish to be recorded? Mr. Deutsch.
Mr. Deutsch votes no.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Connolly.
I vote nay.
Mr. Connolly votes no.
Anybody else? The clerk will report the tally.
There's one more vote, Mr. Trone.
Let's hold Mr. Trone.
You're not recorded, sir. Mr. Trone votes no. Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 16 ayes and 23 noes.
16 ayes and 23 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. Do other members seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
I have an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Buck. The clerk will please report the amendment. Thank you. Huh?
Did you start reading it? Okay.
You're voting no.
Okay. The clerk will please report the amendment.
Don't say this yet.
Buck, Amendment Number 1. At the end of the bill, add the following new section. Section 6, recognizing the duty of the federal government to create a Green New Deal. A, findings. Congress finds the following. The October 2018 report entitled Special Report on Global Warming of 1.5 Celsius by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in the November 2018 Fourth National Climate Assessment Report found that human activity...
Without objection, further reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. A point of order is reserved. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're here to discuss a serious problem, the socialist takeover of the Democratic Party. The idea that Washington knows best is just oozing from every pore of the people's house these days. This bill is no different. The underlying bill, the Climate Action Now Act, is nothing more than a progressive temper tantrum after President Trump wisely withdrew us from the flawed Paris Climate Agreement. I asked my colleagues, what did this sage and sensible climate deal that President Obama didn't even bother submitting as a treaty offer us as a nation? I'll tell you exactly what we got from the deal. A big stocking full of coal that is completely useless because we can't use it to heat our homes. We have an empty agreement that makes people feel good about how the U.S. is, quote, doing something, quote, while China and Russia are able to continue emitting greenhouse gases with impunity for another 13 years. We're being asked to spend billions, if not trillions of dollars to meet these emissions goals. And Democrats' schemes will kill jobs, raise America's energy bills, kick more people from the middle class, and limit our country's global leadership capabilities just so we can feel good about ourselves. That doesn't sound like global leadership. It sounds like the Democrats' fantasy to remove our private sector's power and remake America into a government-controlled socialist state. This brings me to another socialist climate fantasy of the Democratic Party, the Green New Deal. Speaker Pelosi said this fantasy land plan is, quote, about jobs. It's about good-paying green jobs. It's about public health, clean air, and clean water for our children. It's about defending national security, end of quote. Even Newsweek, which is not exactly a bastion of conservative thought, commented that, quote, the Climate Action Now Act would fall far short of instilling the broad, sweeping reforms that the Green New Deal call for. This plan that Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Ed Markey introduced is transformational. Transformational in that it will turn America into the socialist state that Bernie Sanders has cried for since he spent his honeymoon in Soviet Russia. The Green New Deal is a government takeover of our nation's economy that puts Washington's social planners in control, while some on the left have argued that it's the only way to stop our world from ending in a decade. I don't believe killing all the cows and making my colleagues from Hawaii and Puerto Rico take a boat to work every day will really save the world. Among other highlights from the Green New Deal, we will replace every building in the United States, we'll completely cut out all fossil fuels in 10 years, we'll outlaw combustion engines, and guarantee a job for every person, whether or not they want to work. An analysis Chairman Burr recently released from Senate consideration showed that the Green New Deal will raise an average American family's power bill by $3,800 per year. And even worse, we'll be asking our kids and grandkids to foot the astounding $93 trillion bill to realize this punch-drunk fantasy. This plan will do nothing to help our economy. It will only serve to halt profitable industries, hurt American families, and burden us with such a great debt that we will not be able to defend ourselves if we are attacked by a foreign adversary. No wonder my Democratic colleagues are nervous about being held accountable for their plan. This political courage is on display when the Senate voted 0 in favor, 57 opposed, and 43, that's right, 43 present votes. In fact, the sponsor of this legislation, Congresswoman Castor, didn't commit to bring the Green New Deal up for a vote. My amendment gives my colleagues exactly that opportunity. Adopt my amendment and give the House the opportunity to stand and be counted on this measure. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I raise a point of order that the amendment is not germane. Does any member wish to be heard on the point of order?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I don't understand why it would not be germane. It is an environmental bill in front of the committee right now, and this is an environmental amendment to the bill.
Okay. The amendment relates to a subject to which there is no reference in the text before us. The objective of the amendment is unrelated to the objective of H.R. 9.
Mr. Chairman, may I be heard?
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I think that clean air and clean water are in both pieces of legislation. I think that the intent is the same. I'm sure that my Democrat colleagues understand the financial burdens that their current legislation places on us, and I'm sure they understand that the Green New Deal, while it would go further, no doubt, it would still place huge burdens on us, and I believe that the relevance, the germaneness is clear. If this were a piece of legislation solely dealing with jobs or solely dealing with some non-related issue, I would agree with the Chair, but I would ask the Chair to reconsider his ruling.
Parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Chairman.
Well, let me rule again. The Chair finds that the amendment is not germane.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a vote on that, please.
State your parliamentary inquiry.
My parliamentary inquiry was, you've just answered, has the Chair made a ruling?
Yes.
I thank the Chair.
Who else seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a vote on that.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman. There's no vote on a rule. There's nothing pending to request a vote on. Ruling's been made.
Mr. Chairman, I appeal the ruling of the Chair.
Gentleman's appealing the rule. Appealing the rule. The Chair.
Move to table. Yes. Move to table. Mr. Chairman, I move to table.
Okay. The vote is on the motion to table. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
My opinion, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for the ayes and nays on that, please.
The ayes and nays have been asked for, have been ordered.
The
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Sherman. Mr. Meeks. Mr. Meeks. Mr. Meeks votes aye. Mr. Sires.
Aye.
Mr. Sires votes aye. Mr. Connolly.
Aye.
Mr. Connolly votes aye. Mr. Deutsch. Mr. Deutsch votes aye. Ms. Bass. Mr. Keating.
Aye.
Mr. Keating votes aye. Mr. Cicilline.
Aye.
Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Barra. Oh, sorry. Mr. Barra votes aye. Mr. Castro. Mr. Castro votes aye. Ms. Titus. Ms. Titus votes aye. Mr. Espaillat. Mr. Espaillat votes aye. Mr. Liu. Mr. Liu votes aye. Ms. Wild. Ms. Wild votes aye. Mr. Phillips. Mr. Phillips votes aye. Ms. Omar. Mr. Allred. Mr. Allred votes aye. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin votes aye. Ms. Spanberger. Ms. Spanberger? Oh. Okay. Ms. Houlihan? Ms. Houlihan votes aye. Mr. Malinowski? Mr. Malinowski votes aye. Mr. Trone? Aye. Mr. Trone votes aye. Mr. Costa? Mr. Costa? Mr. Costa? Mr. Costa votes aye. Mr. Vargas? Mr. Vargas votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Mr. McCall?
No.
Mr. McCall votes no. Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith votes no. Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Wilson? Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Perry? Mr. Perry votes no. Mr. Yoho? Mr. Yoho votes no. Mr. Kinzinger? Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Zeldin? Mr. Zeldin votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mrs. Wagner? Mrs. Wagner votes no. Mr. Mast? Mr. Mast votes no. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Fitzpatrick? Mr. Curtis? Mr. Curtis votes no. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes no. Mr. Rustenthaler? Mr. Burchett? Mr. Burchett votes no. Mr. Pence? Mr. Pence votes no. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes no. Mr. Guest? Mr. Guest votes no. Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman votes aye.
Are there any others who seek to vote?
Ms. Bamberger, you're not recorded yet. Ms. Bamberger votes aye.
Anyone else who hasn't voted who would like to vote at this time? Okay, clerk will report the results.
There she is.
Oh. Is that her?
It's her dance video.
That's global news.
That's what's going on.
Oh, that's AOC. Oh, I've seen that.
I didn't mean for the volume.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there are 23 ayes and 17 noes.
23 ayes and 17 noes. The ruling of the motion to table is agreed to. The ruling of the chair is that the amendment is not germane, is sustained. Is there further debate or amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk. Ask for its immediate consideration at this time.
What purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk, and I would ask for immediate consideration.
Gentleman from New York has 5 minutes.
This amendment would require that the Paris Agreement obtain ratification from the Senate. The Paris Climate Agreement was a treaty.
Will the gentleman suspend? I just want to make sure the clerk will report the amendment before the gentleman speaks.
Zeldin Amendment Number 1. At the end of the bill, add the following section. Section 6, effective date. This act shall take effect on
Without
the date-
objection, further reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. A point of order is reserved. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would require that the Paris Agreement obtain ratification from the Senate. The Paris Climate Agreement was a treaty in every sense of the term. The United States Constitution says that treaties must obtain the advice and consent of the Senate before the United States may lawfully enter into the agreement. President Obama deemed the Paris Agreement to not be a treaty in order to evade constitutional review. While the duly elected legislatures in other nations like Canada and the European Union hosted hearings, debates, and ultimately voted on the Paris Accord, President Obama chose to bypass the Constitution and entered into this sweeping international agreement without seeking congressional approval. These types of agreements should be agreed to in a transparent manner that follows the Constitution and the law. I support many overall goals here, but the United States approached this entire Paris climate agreement all wrong. Other nations made modest commitments pegged to their GDP growth, while President Obama made a unilateral pledge to bring emissions 25 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. There are some very important practical issues with that pledge regarding feasibility, which especially include unmanageable time constraints and energy cost increases for our constituents. Last week, we held a hearing on this issue, and every single witness agreed that the Senate should ratify any future Paris climate agreement. Any international deal going forward needs congressional input and a vote that lays out the negotiating goals and a ratification vote after the fact. That is why I'm offering this amendment today and encourage every member to support it. I yield back the rest of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin, is recognized for 5
Thank you,
minutes.
Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition to this amendment. My friend from New York earlier in the day was saying, let's have discussions about how we can achieve these objectives and approve, and tackle climate change. But this amendment is simply a delay tactic. The amendment would delay the effective date of this bill until the Senate ratifies the Paris Agreement. but the Paris Agreement does not require Senate ratification. The President had authority to enter into the Paris Agreement, derived from the Constitution, the Senate-approved United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and domestic law. The United States enters into international agreements all the time without Senate ratification. This language indefinitely delays the effective date of this bill. The gentleman knows very well the Senate has no intention of ratifying this. It's a pure delay tactic, and I urge my colleagues to vote no. Thank you.
Anyone else seek recognition? I thank the gentleman. Anyone else seek recognition?
Mr. Perry.
Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield to my friend, Mr. Zeldin.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. And to my colleague who had just spoken, and there have been a lot of speeches today where we're putting words into the mouths of Republicans. This is a genuine concern that was expressed. And last week, we had 3 Democratic witnesses and 1 Republican witness, and all 4 agreed that this should have been submitted as a treaty. And I had an exchange with one of my other colleagues on the other side of the aisle to an earlier amendment, and that colleague on your side of the aisle also acknowledged the fact. Now, I don't know, I haven't spoken to every single member on your side of the aisle as to whether or not you believe the Paris Agreement should have been submitted as a treaty. I'm not going to attempt to try to speak for anyone I haven't spoken to on the other side of the aisle, but it's a genuine belief that the Paris Agreement should have been submitted as a treaty. It was a genuine belief that the Iran nuclear deal should have been submitted as a treaty. It's okay if you want to disagree with us, but where we request a treaty to be submitted to the Senate for ratification, just to make the claim that it's simply a delaying tactic, it's with all due respect. I mean, just understand that there are people who believe that the Paris Agreement was a treaty that should have been submitted. There are people who believe that there should have been hearings, that there should have been public debate and votes and input by Congress. If you disagree that Congress should have a role to play in agreeing to the Paris Agreement, you can have that position. But it's our position on our side of the aisle, at least I'm speaking for myself. The Paris Agreement should have been treated as a treaty. But it just, with all due respect to Mr. Levin, we haven't had a chance really to meet in person. Just to understand that we genuinely have that position on our side of the aisle.
Will the gentleman yield? Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you so much, and I really appreciate your comments. I really do take your concern to be genuine. Last week we had, no one here from the State Department. It's the State Department that makes the determination about whether something like this needs to be, go to the Senate. The State Department made that determination at the time. But in any event, I and my colleagues, and I wish it were more bipartisan, feel strongly that the Paris Accord is a modest first step in a long, urgent road to move much faster to tackle climate change. I haven't heard, honestly, I don't think a single word from that side of the room today about concrete ideas that you wish to put forward to move our country faster to tackle climate change or our world. And in fact, in all the time that you were in total control of this Congress, not a single thing happened. So I do appreciate the genuineness of your concern. I look forward to working with you on so many matters, but I have to oppose the amendment. Thank you so much.
And I appreciate the gentleman for his remarks. Earlier, he was speaking about actions that were taken by the states of New York and California and crediting the states for the reduction in emissions over the course of the last 10 or 15 years. There are others who have a different take. They believe that market forces contributed to the reduction of emissions, and we could debate it. Maybe we'll have a disagreement. But with regards to the last point that the gentleman just stated, as far as what we feel on our side of the aisle, many of my colleagues who I've spoken to believe that market forces and new technology and companies making the right decisions, that the economy, that a lot of positive progress with regards to the environment can be done not by the government intervention of New York and California as much as the use of technology and new ways to be able to provide.
Well, I know your time's expiring. Let me just say that for the last 7 years before I joined the Congress, I ran a private company that drove climate change in the state of, I wasn't referring to New York and California. I was proudly, although silently, referring to Michigan. And it was government policy, but also market forces. I'm all for market forces, but they need clear signals from the government, and I so appreciate the discussion.
Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. Any other members who wish to speak? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. All those opposed, say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chair, request a recorded vote.
There's been a request for a recorded vote, and the clerk will please call the roll.
Mr. Sherman. Mr. Meeks. No. Mr. Meeks votes no. Mr. Sires. No. Mr. Sires votes no. Mr. Connolly.
No.
Mr. Connolly votes no. Mr. Deutsch. Yes. Mr. Deutsch votes no. Ms. Bass. Mr. Keating. Mr. Keating votes no. Mr. Cicilline. No. Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Barra. Mr. Barra votes no. Mr. Castro. Mr. Castro votes no. Ms. Titus. Ms. Titus votes no. Mr. Espaillat. No. Mr. Espaillat votes no. Mr. Liu. No. Mr. Liu votes no. Ms. Wild. Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Phillips. Mr. Phillips votes no. Ms. Omar. Mr. Allred. Mr. Allred votes no. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Spamberger. Ms. Houlihan. Ms. Houlihan votes no. Mr. Malinowski. Mr. Malinowski votes no. Mr. Trone. Mr. Trone votes no. Mr. Costa. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas votes no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez votes no. Mr. McCall.
Aye.
Mr. McCall votes aye. Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith votes aye. Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry votes aye. Mr. Yoho. Mr. Yoho votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes aye. Mr. Zeldin. Mr. Zeldin votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner votes aye. Mr. Mast. Mr. Mast votes aye. Mr. Rooney. Mr. Fitzpatrick. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Curtis votes aye. Mr. Buck. Mr. Buck votes aye. Mr. Wright. Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Rustenthaler. Mr. Burchett. Mr. Burchett votes aye. Mr. Pence. Mr. Pence votes aye. Mr. Watkins. Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Guest. Mr. Guest votes aye. Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman votes no. Mr. Costa.
Mr. Costa.
Mr. Costa votes no.
Ms. Spamberger.
Ms. Spamberger votes no.
Anyone who hasn't voted would like to do so? Mr. Sherman.
Just in time.
Mr. Sherman votes no.
Clerk shall tally and call the roll. Clerk shall tally. Okay. Yeah.
go to here. Then no one says.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 17 ayes and 24 noes.
17 ayes and 24 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any other requests for recognition? Hearing none, we then move on to final passage. Hearing no further requests for recognition, the question is to report H.R. 9, the Climate Action Now Act, to the House with the recommendation that the bill do pass. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. McCall.
I request a recorded vote.
The ranking member requests a recorded vote. The question is to report H.R. 9, the Climate Action Now Act, to the House with the recommendation that the bill do pass. The clerk will please call the roll.
Mr. Sherman?
Aye.
Mr. Sherman votes aye. Mr. Meeks? Aye. Mr. Meeks votes aye. Mr. Sierras?
Aye.
Mr. Sierras votes aye. Mr. Connolly?
Aye.
Mr. Connolly votes aye. Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Deutsch votes aye. Ms. Bass? Mr. Keating? Mr. Keating votes aye. Mr. Cicilline?
Aye.
Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Barra? Mr. Barra votes aye. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes aye. Ms. Titus? Ms. Titus votes aye. Mr. Espaillat? Mr. Espaillat votes aye. Mr. Liu? Mr. Liu votes aye. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes aye. Mr. Phillips? Mr. Phillips votes aye. Ms. Omar? Mr. Allred? Mr. Allred votes aye. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes aye. Ms. Spamberger? Ms. Spamberger votes aye. Ms. Houlihan? Ms. Houlihan votes aye. Mr. Malinowski? Mr. Malinowski votes aye. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes aye. Mr. Costa? Mr. Costa votes aye. Mr. Vargas? Mr. Vargas votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Mr. McCall?
No.
Mr. McCall votes no. Mr. Smith? Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Wilson? Mr. Wilson votes no. Mr. Perry? Mr. Perry votes no. Mr. Yoho? Mr. Yoho votes no. Mr. Kinzinger? Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Zeldin? Mr. Zeldin votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mrs. Wagner? No. Mrs. Wagner votes no. Mr. Mast? Mr. Mast votes no. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Fitzpatrick? Mr. Curtis? Mr. Curtis votes no. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes no. Mr. Rushenthaler? Mr. Burchett? Mr. Burchett votes no. Mr. Pence? Mr. Pence votes no. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes no. Mr. Guest? Mr. Guest votes no. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman votes aye.
Have all members been recorded?
What? Mr. Castro's been recorded.
The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 24 ayes and 16 noes.
24 ayes and 16 noes. The ayes have it. The measure is ordered favorably reported.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Pursuant
Mr. McCall.
Pursuant to House rules, I request that members have the opportunity to submit views for any committee report that may be produced on any of today's measures.
Without objection. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes for all the measures considered today So this concludes our business. I want to thank Ranking Member McCall and all of the committee members for their contributions and assistance with today's markup. The committee stands adjourned.
Would have still been